What if not all alien races come in peace? Across UFO lore, abduction reports, and conspiracy theories, three species are repeatedly described as the most feared beings humanity could encounter: the Alpha-Draconians, the mysterious Insectoid Aliens, and the infamous Reptilians. Some witnesses claim these entities possess advanced technology, incredible intelligence, and agendas that may conflict with humanity's future. But where did these stories come from? Are these beings real extraterrestrials, or are they the darkest legends ever created by the UFO phenomenon? In this video, we explore the three alien races most often portrayed as hostile to humanity and the chilling theories surrounding them. For more than 7 decades, a quiet but persistent thread has run through military archives, intelligence debriefings, and the testimony of people who otherwise have nothing to gain by speaking. It is the claim that humanity is not alone, and more troubling still, that not everything sharing this universe with us regards our species with curiosity or goodwill. Within the community of researchers, contactees, and former defense insiders who have spent careers piecing together this picture, a working hierarchy has emerged. Out of dozens of alleged non-human intelligences described across thousands of testimonies, 3 are named again and again as the most consistently hostile to human beings: the Reptilians, the Alpha-Draconians, and the Insectoids. This is their story, as it has been pieced together from declassified documents, abduction case files, whistleblower testimony, and the oldest myths our species ever told about itself. Before going further, it is worth understanding why these 3 and not others. The taxonomy of alleged extraterrestrial contact is large. Researchers catalog dozens of types, the small, gray-skinned beings most associated with the classic abduction narrative. The tall, blonde, Nordic-presenting visitors described in contactee literature since the 1950s, blue avians, multi-dimensional light beings, and craft-bound entities that never show a face at all. Most of these categories, according to the testimony collected over decades, are described in neutral or even benevolent terms. Contactees describe Nordics offering warnings about nuclear weapons. Researchers describe Greys as detached, almost clinical, more interested in biological data than domination. But 3 categories break this pattern entirely. Across hundreds of independent accounts gathered from different countries, different decades, and different investigators who in many cases never spoke to one another, the same 3 names surface whenever the testimony turns toward predation, domination, and open hostility. The first criterion researchers use to classify a contact as hostile is intent. Does the entity described act with apparent indifference to human autonomy, treating the species as a resource rather than a counterpart? The second is method. Does the pattern of activity involve coercion, abduction without consent, or physical harm, as opposed to communication, negotiation, or peaceful observation? The third is structural permanence. Is there evidence the activity is not an isolated incident, but part of a sustained, multi-generational program, the kind of long-range operation only a stable and motivated civilization could run for centuries or millennia? Reptilians, Alpha-Draconians, and Insectoids meet all 3 criteria more consistently than any other category in the literature, which is why they have earned, however informally, the designation of humanity's principal adversaries in the alleged extraterrestrial landscape. It would be a mistake to treat these 3 as separate, unrelated phenomena occurring by coincidence. The testimony, when laid side by side, describes something closer to a command structure. Alpha-Draconians are described as the ruling caste, a winged reptilian-adjacent species occupying the apex of a multi-species hierarchy believed to operate from star systems associated with the Draco constellation, most often Thuban, the star that served as Earth's pole star roughly 5,000 years ago, a detail that recurs often enough in the literature to be treated as significant by researchers who study the alignment between ancient astronomy and alleged extraterrestrial origin points. Beneath the Draconians, in this alleged hierarchy, sit the Reptilians, described as a more numerous, more terrestrially embedded species, organized into castes of their own, and functioning as administrators, enforcers, and according to some testimony, direct genetic architects of long-running breeding and control programs aimed at the human species. The Insectoids occupy a third and distinct role in the testimony, frequently described not as rulers or enforcers, but as technicians, geneticists, and handlers, beings whose mantis-like physiology and collective, hive-oriented psychology make them uniquely suited, according to the accounts, to the clinical and procedural aspects of whatever long-term program is allegedly underway. This script will examine each of these three in turn, beginning with the Reptilians, moving to the Alpha-Draconians, who are described as standing above them, and concluding with the Insectoids, before bringing all three together in a final comparative analysis. Each section draws on the same body of source material: declassified or leaked military documents, the testimony of contactees and abductees collected by researchers across more than half a century, the statements of self-described former insiders from defense and intelligence backgrounds, and the comparative mythology that, according to proponents of what is sometimes called the ancient contact hypothesis, may encode folk memory of these same beings reaching back to the earliest written records our species possesses. It is worth pausing here to address the obvious question any careful listener will be asking. None of what follows constitutes proven, peer-reviewed scientific fact in the conventional sense. What follows is a synthesis of testimony, a body of claims that researchers in this field treat with the same rigor they would apply to any uncorroborated historical account. Cross-referencing one report against another, looking for convergence, and noting where details repeat across sources that have no apparent connection. The pattern of convergence is, to those who study it closely, the most compelling part of the case. A grandmother in rural Brazil in 1979 describing a reptilian abductor in terms strikingly similar to a retired American naval officer describing a 1987 incident at a remote installation is not, by itself, proof. But when that same convergence repeats across hundreds of cases spanning every populated continent, every decade since the Second World War, and demographics with no contact with one another, the testimony begins to function less like isolated fantasy and more like independent witnesses describing the same underlying reality from different vantage points. That is the standard this script holds itself to. Not legal proof, but the kind of convergent, cross-reference testimony that has, in other fields, been treated as the foundation of a credible historical record long before physical evidence caught up. The modern chapter of this story begins in the years immediately following the Second World War, when a sudden spike in reported unidentified aerial phenomena coincided with the dawn of the nuclear age. It is not a coincidence researchers in this field treat lightly. Multiple testimonies from former Strategic Air Command personnel describe unidentified craft appearing directly over nuclear missile silos in the continental United States, on more than one occasion, allegedly causing temporary shutdowns of entire missile flights without any conventional electromagnetic explanation. These incidents, documented in officer logs and corroborated by multiple independent witnesses at separate facilities, are cited by researchers as the opening moves in what they describe as an extended period of contact, observation, and in some cases direct intervention by non-human intelligences specifically focused on humanity's weapons capability. Whether this activity should be read as protective, as some contactee testimony suggests regarding the Nordic-type visitors, or as a different and more proprietary form of interest, as the reptilian and draconian material suggests, depends entirely on which thread of testimony one is following. This script follows the thread that describes interest without benevolence, observation without consent, and a long game whose endpoint is described across multiple independent sources in remarkably consistent terms, not destruction, but control. That distinction matters and deserves to be stated plainly before going further. The testimony associated with these three races almost never describes an intention to destroy humanity outright. What it describes instead is a pattern of long-term generational management, a program oriented around genetics, resource extraction, and the maintenance of conditions on Earth that keep the human species dependent, divided, and unaware of the scale of what is allegedly being done to it. Researchers who specialize in this material describe it using the language of agriculture more often than the language of war. The recurring phrase across decades of testimony, attributed to multiple independent abductees with no contact with one another, is some version of the claim that humanity is being treated as a herd, valuable precisely because it is productive and worth managing rather than eliminating. This framing helps explain a detail that otherwise seems strange. Why, if these races are hostile, has there been no open conflict, no announced arrival, no event visible to the entire world at once? The testimony's answer is consistent. The operation, if it exists, depends on concealment. A managed population that does not know it is managed offers far less resistance than one that does. Secrecy is not a side effect of the program, according to this body of testimony. It is the program's central operating principle, maintained through a combination of the sheer difficulty of proving extraordinary claims, official ridicule directed at witnesses, and in the testimony of a smaller number of more controversial sources, active cooperation between certain human governmental and military factions, and the non-human intelligences themselves, an arrangement researchers describe using terms like exchange programs, technology transfer agreements, and joint underground facilities. That last category of claim, government collusion, is among the most contested in the entire field, and it deserves an honest framing here rather than being smoothed over. The testimony, alleging direct agreements between human governments and hostile non-human intelligences, rests on a smaller and more difficult to verify set of sources than the broader abduction and sighting literature. Names like Dulce, a remote area of New Mexico, repeatedly cited in testimony as the location of a joint underground facility, recur across multiple independent witness accounts, but the underlying documentation remains, by the nature of the claim, classified, fragmentary, or impossible to independently confirm through conventional means. This script presents that testimony as testimony, not as established fact, because that is the honest standard the material itself deserves. What can be said with more confidence is that the pattern of claims is remarkably stable across decades, that the individuals making the most detailed claims about underground facilities and joint operations frequently describe backgrounds in defense, intelligence, or military engineering that would plausibly grant them access to exactly the kind of compartmentalized program they describe, and that polygraph examinations administered to a number of these witnesses by independent examiners have in several documented cases returned results consistent with the witnesses believing their own testimony to be true, whatever the underlying reality actually was. Turning to the ancient world, the same three categories that dominate modern testimony appear, transformed by myth and language, but recognizably consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. Serpent and dragon imagery associated with divine or semi-divine ruling figures appears independently in ancient Mesopotamia, where the Anunnaki of Sumerian text are described in terms that some researchers read as describing a reptilian or serpent-associated ruling class descending from the heavens to govern early human civilization. It appears in ancient Egypt, where serpent imagery is bound inseparably to kingship itself, worn on the crown of every pharaoh as the uraeus, the rearing cobra positioned at the brow as a symbol of divine and absolute authority. It appears in Mesoamerica, where Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, the feathered serpent deities central to Aztec and Mayan cosmology, are described as bringers of law, agriculture, and civilization itself, arriving from elsewhere to reorganize human society according to their own design. It appears in China, where the dragon is not a monster to be slain, as in the European tradition, but the literal symbol of imperial legitimacy, the emperor himself described for thousands of years as the son of the dragon, and it appears in a different register throughout Vedic and broader South Asian tradition, where the Naga, serpent beings of immense power and ambiguous loyalty, are described as living in vast subterranean cities and possessing knowledge and technology beyond ordinary human reach. Researchers who advance the ancient contact hypothesis argue that this is too much convergence to dismiss as coincidence, particularly because the geographic separation between these civilizations at the time these traditions were forming was, in most cases, total. Sumer and the early Mayan world had no contact. Ancient Egypt and ancient China had no contact. And yet the same image, a serpent or dragon-associated being of immense authority, descending from the sky or rising from beneath the earth to claim dominion over human affairs, repeats with a consistency that is difficult to explain through cultural diffusion alone. The alternative explanation offered by proponents of this hypothesis is direct, that these myths are not myths in the dismissive modern sense at all, but garbled, symbolically encoded historical memory, the only vocabulary available to ancient peoples attempting to describe contact with non-human intelligences, whose actual nature, physiology, and technology were entirely outside their existing frame of reference. The insectoid thread runs through ancient material as well, though it surfaces less frequently and in more fragmentary form than the serpent and dragon imagery associated with reptilians and draconians. Some researchers point to certain rock art traditions, particularly in regions of North Africa and the American Southwest, depicting elongated, multi-limbed humanoid figures with disproportionately large heads and what some interpret as compound or wraparound eyes as early visual testimony to insectoid contact. The interpretation here is more speculative than the serpent and dragon material, and this script treats it accordingly as a thinner thread of evidence worth noting rather than a load-bearing pillar of the overall case. What strengthens the insectoid category instead is the consistency of modern testimony, which becomes the primary evidentiary base for that section of this script, rather than ancient comparative mythology. Modern abduction researchers, working independently across different decades and continents, began noticing a secondary figure appearing in a significant minority of abduction accounts starting in the 1980s and intensifying through the 1990s and beyond. Where the classic abduction narrative centers on small gray-skinned beings conducting what witnesses describe as medical or genetic procedures, a subset of these same witnesses describe a different figure present during the same encounters, taller, thinner, insectoid rather than humanoid in proportion, and most distinctively, communicating not through the flat telepathic affect typically attributed to grays, but through what witnesses consistently describe as an overwhelming, almost paralyzing psychic presence. This figure, which researchers came to refer to using the shorthand term Mantis, being, owing to its similarity in body plan to the terrestrial praying mantis, is described in testimony gathered independently across the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and parts of South America by researchers who in several documented cases had no professional contact with one another and were unaware their respective witness pools were describing the same entity until comparative work was done years later. What unites all three categories, reptilian, alpha-draconian, and insectoid, beyond the alleged hierarchy that places them in relationship to one another, is the consistency with which the testimony assigns them a shared underlying objective. Across the literature, regardless of which specific race a given testimony centers on, three recurring goals appear: access to and modification of human genetic material, maintenance of a long-term information and resource extraction relationship with the human species conducted largely outside of human awareness or consent, and active interference in human technological, spiritual, and political development at key inflection points. Interference oriented, according to the testimony, toward preventing the kind of full sovereignty and self-determination that would make humanity difficult to manage in the way these three races are alleged to require. This script will not ask for belief. It will lay out, race by race, the testimony, the comparative mythology, the documented incidents, and the case studies that constitute the body of evidence researchers in this field have assembled over more than 70 years of investigation, and it will let that material speak for itself. What can be said at the outset is this: whatever the underlying truth of these claims turns out to be, the scale, consistency, and cross-cultural convergence of the testimony itself is a phenomenon worth taking seriously, independent of any final judgment about its ultimate source. Witnesses on every continent, across every decade since organized investigation of this subject began, describing entities they had no shared cultural reference point to invent collaboratively, converging again and again on the same three categories of being, the same alleged hierarchy, and the same long-term objectives, is not nothing. It is, at minimum, one of the most persistent and internally consistent bodies of anomalous testimony in the modern record, and it deserves the same careful, unsentimental examination this script intends to give it. It is worth examining, before moving into the case-by-case material, how this body of testimony was actually gathered, because the methodology matters as much as the content. The primary investigative tool used across decades of abduction research has been hypnotic regression, a technique in which a trained clinician guides a witness back through a period of apparent memory loss, commonly described by abductees as missing time, in an attempt to recover details the conscious mind either suppressed or was prevented from retaining. This methodology is not without serious critics, and an honest account of the field must include their objections. Memory researchers have demonstrated that hypnotic regression carries a documented risk of confabulation, the unintentional construction of false memories, shaped by a clinician's leading questions or by cultural narratives the subject absorbed long before ever sitting down for a session. Skeptical investigators point to this risk as sufficient, on its own, to explain the entire abduction phenomenon as a product of suggestion rather than genuine encounter. Proponents of the testimony respond with two counter-arguments worth stating fairly. First, a meaningful percentage of detailed abduction accounts, including some of the most frequently cited cases in the literature, were reported by witnesses under their own power, with no hypnosis involved, often within hours or days of the event, before any clinician had the opportunity to shape the narrative. Second, even within hypnotically recovered testimony, researchers point to physical evidence that does not depend on memory at all. Unexplained scarring, small subdermal objects later removed and examined by independent laboratories, and physiological markers consistent with documented trauma, all reported in a subset of cases independent of what the witness recalled or didn't recall under hypnosis. Neither side of this debate has produced a conclusion the other accepts, and this script does not pretend otherwise. What it does claim is that the testimony, whatever its ultimate origin, has been gathered with enough methodological self-awareness by researchers who in many cases hold credentials in psychology, psychiatry, or clinical medicine that it merits more than dismissal. The institutional history of how governments have responded to this category of testimony forms its own layer of the record, and a brief survey of it is necessary context for everything that follows. In the years immediately after the 1947 incident near Roswell, New Mexico, an event whose conventional explanation has shifted more than once in official accounts over the following decades, the United States Air Force ran a sequence of investigative programs, beginning with Project Sign in 1948, continuing through the more dismissive Project Grudge, and culminating in Project Blue Book, which operated from 1952 until its closure in 1969, and which compiled over 12,000 reported sightings, of which several hundred were ultimately classified by the project's own investigators as unexplained by any conventional means. A parallel and less publicly known body, the Robertson Panel, convened by the CIA in January 1953, recommended a policy of public debunking and education specifically designed to reduce the volume of sighting reports reaching official channels, a recommendation that several researchers in this field point to as the formal origin point of the modern culture of ridicule that has surrounded this subject in mainstream institutional life ever since. That posture persisted, with only minor variation, for nearly 70 years. until December 2017, when major American newspapers confirmed the existence of a previously secret Pentagon initiative, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which had been investigating unidentified aerial phenomena since at least 2007. That confirmation was followed by a sequence of further institutional acknowledgments through the early 2020s, including congressional hearings in which active-duty military pilots testified under oath to repeated encounters with craft demonstrating flight characteristics beyond any known human technology, and the formal establishment of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office to centralize and continue the investigation. None of these institutional developments, it should be said plainly, constitute confirmation of the specific claims this script goes on to examine regarding reptilians, Alpha-Draconians, or insectoids. What they do establish, at the level of acknowledged government record, is that the underlying phenomenon of non-human craft operating in Earth's airspace is no longer seriously disputed by the institutions most resistant to taking it seriously for the preceding 7 decades. The specific character, intent, and origin of whatever is producing that phenomenon remains the contested ground this script is built on. Within the contactee and abduction research community itself, a working framework has developed over the decades to distinguish broad categories of non-human intent, and understanding it helps explain why reptilians, Alpha-Draconians, and insectoids are treated as a distinct cluster rather than lumped in with the wider catalog of reported beings. Researchers and contactees in this tradition frequently describe a basic division between intelligences oriented toward what is termed service to other, characterized by consent-based interaction, transparency, and a stated interest in human well-being and autonomous development, and intelligences oriented toward service to self, characterized by the patterns already described: non-consensual contact, genetic appropriation, and long-term management of the human population as a resource rather than a partner. This is, admittedly, a framework drawn from the testimony itself rather than an external scientific classification, and it should be understood as such, but it is the framework the source material consistently uses to organize itself, and applying it consistently is part of what allows researchers to notice that the same 3 names recur whenever the testimony shifts from contact to predation. Nordic-type beings, blue avian entities, and a number of other, less frequently reported categories cluster heavily on the service to other side of this line in the available testimony. Reptilians, Alpha-Draconians, and insectoids cluster, with similar consistency, on the other side. It is also worth addressing directly why these 3 are described as operating together rather than independently, because the alliance structure is central to understanding the scale of what the testimony alleges. Individually, each of these 3 races is described, even by the witnesses most convinced of their hostility, as a serious but bounded problem, a dangerous non-human presence operating largely in the margins of human awareness. What elevates the testimony from isolated anomaly to systemic concern is the consistency with which independent sources describe these 3 as functioning within a single coordinated structure, each occupying a distinct role that depends on the other 2. The Draconians are described, across the testimony examined in detail later in this script, as supplying command authority and strategic direction. The Reptilians are described as supplying numbers, terrestrial infrastructure, and direct enforcement. The insectoids are described as supplying the specialized genetic and technical expertise the broader program is alleged to depend on. No single one of these roles on its own is described as sufficient to explain the full scope of what witnesses report. Together, according to the testimony, they form something closer to an integrated operation than 3 coincidentally overlapping phenomena, which is precisely why researchers in this field treat them as a unit worthy of combined examination rather than 3 separate case files. A handful of researchers did more than anyone else to build the evidentiary foundation this script relies on, and their names recur throughout the material that follows. Bud Hopkins, a working artist who became one of the first investigators to systematically document abduction testimony beginning in the late 1970s, was among the earliest to notice the recurring physical evidence pattern, the small scars and unexplained marks reported across witnesses with no contact with one another. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, brought formal clinical credibility to the field starting in the early 1990s, conducting hundreds of hours of structured interviews with abductees and concluding, controversially within his own academic institution, that the trauma his subjects displayed was consistent with a real experience of some kind, rather than fabrication or ordinary psychiatric illness. Mack faced a formal inquiry from Harvard over his conclusions, an inquiry that ultimately cleared him of any violation of academic standards, a detail researchers in this field cite often as evidence that even rigorous institutional scrutiny failed to discredit the underlying clinical observations. David Jacobs, a historian who spent over 3 decades conducting hypnotic regression interviews, became one of the principal sources for the specific claim that a coordinated, multi-generational hybridization program is underway, a claim that recurs heavily in the reptilian and insectoid material examined later in this script. Jacques Vallée, a computer scientist and astronomer who began his career working on early digital cataloging of UFO data for the French government before relocating to the United States, contributed a different and in some ways more skeptical thread to the field, arguing that the phenomenon's persistence across human history under different cultural names, fairies, demons, and angels in earlier centuries, extraterrestrials in the modern one, suggested something stranger than a simple biological visitation, an argument that nonetheless reinforced the comparative mythology approach this script draws on in its treatment of ancient serpent and dragon traditions. These researchers disagreed with one another on significant points, and this script does not flatten those disagreements. What unites them, and what justifies treating their combined body of work as a serious foundation rather than a fringe curiosity, is the methodological seriousness each brought to material that institutional science, for most of their careers, refused to examine at all. The modern era has added a new category of evidence to this older foundation, one less dependent on individual testimony and more grounded in sensor data, and it deserves brief mention here because it forms the backdrop against which contemporary witnesses now come forward. Infrared and radar footage released by the United States Navy beginning in 2017, recorded by advanced fighter sensor systems and corroborated by multiple aircrew across separate incidents off both the American East and West coasts, documents objects performing maneuvers, instantaneous acceleration, sustained hypersonic speed without any visible propulsion signature, and apparent disregard for inertial forces that would destroy any known human aircraft or its pilot, that defense officials testifying before Congress have stated under oath they cannot explain through any conventional aerospace technology, foreign or domestic. This footage does not, by itself, speak to the specific identity or intent of whatever is being observed. It does not confirm the reptilian, draconian, or insectoid testimony examined in this script. What it does is remove one of the principal grounds on which that older testimony was historically dismissed: the assumption that no genuinely anomalous craft exist in Earth's airspace at all. Once that assumption is no longer tenable at the level of acknowledged military record, the older body of witness testimony regarding what occupants of such craft might look like and what they might want becomes considerably harder to wave away as pure invention. It is appropriate, before the script moves into its first detailed case study, to acknowledge the human cost embedded in this material, because the testimony at the center of this story was not collected from people speaking abstractly about a phenomenon happening to someone else. It was collected from individuals describing what they experienced as the most disorienting and frequently traumatic events of their lives, often at significant personal cost. Witnesses who came forward publicly in the early decades of this research routinely describe professional retaliation, social isolation, and ridicule severe enough that many credible accounts are believed by researchers in the field to have gone permanently unreported. Clinicians who worked with these witnesses, including Mack and others who followed his example, consistently describe a level of detailed, consistent, and physiologically corroborated distress in their patients that they regard as inconsistent with simple fabrication, whatever the ultimate explanation for the underlying experience turns out to be. This script proceeds from that same baseline of respect for the witnesses whose testimony it relies on, treating their accounts neither as unquestionable fact nor as automatic delusion, but as serious testimony describing something that happened to them, examined with the same care any historian would apply to a difficult and contested body of first-hand source material. With that foundation in place, the framework, the methodology, the institutional history, and the human stakes, it becomes possible to move into the specific material on each of the three races without constantly relitigating these underlying questions. Each section that follows will draw on the same standard: testimony weighed by its consistency across independent sources, physical and documentary evidence noted where it exists, and the honest acknowledgement of where the record remains thin or contested. The reptilians are the natural starting point, not because they are necessarily the most powerful of the three. The testimony consistently places that position with the Alpha-Draconians, but because they are the most extensively documented, the most frequently reported in direct testimony, and the most deeply embedded in the comparative mythology this script has already begun to trace. In the section that follows, the focus turns to the reptilians, the most frequently reported and most extensively documented of the three races, beginning with the question of where, according to the testimony, they are believed to originate, what their alleged physiology and biology consist of, and how the internal caste structure described across dozens of independent accounts is believed to function. From there, the script will move systematically through their alleged historical involvement in human civilization, their modern operational footprint, and the testimony of those who claim direct contact before turning to the Alpha-Draconians, said to stand above them in the hierarchy, and finally to the Insectoids, whose role, according to the same body of testimony, is neither to rule nor to enforce, but to engineer. Reptilians: origins, physiology, and caste structure. Of the three races examined in this script, the reptilians occupied the largest body of testimony by volume, reported across more independent witness accounts, more government whistleblower statements, and more cross-cultural mythological parallels than either of the other two categories combined. Before examining their alleged conduct toward humanity, it is necessary to establish what the testimony says about who and what they are, where they are believed to originate, what their physical biology consists of, and how the internal social and military structure described across dozens of independent sources is believed to function. This foundation matters because much of what follows in later sections, the genetic programs, the underground installations, the alleged historical infiltration of human civilization, only makes sense once the basic shape of the species itself is understood. The question of origin is among the most contested points in the literature, and the testimony does not speak with a single voice on it. Three competing claims recur across the source material. The first and most frequently cited places the reptilian point of origin in the Alpha-Draconis star system, the same system associated with the Alpha-Draconian race, examined later in this script, with the reptilians described in this version of the testimony as a related but distinct lineage, sometimes characterized as an offshoot or subordinate branch of the Draconian line that diverged at some point in the deep past and developed its own separate identity while remaining bound to the broader hierarchy. The second account, advanced by a smaller but persistent thread of testimony, places reptilian origin not among the stars at all, but beneath the surface of the Earth itself, describing them as an indigenous terrestrial species that developed in parallel with early hominid life and retreated into vast subterranean systems tens of thousands of years ago, following a planetary catastrophe, only resurfacing to interact with humanity at key points in recorded history. The third account, less commonly reported but present in a meaningful minority of sources, ties reptilian origin to the Orion constellation, describing a broader Orion-associated empire of which the reptilians are said to form one military and administrative branch. This script does not attempt to resolve which of these three accounts is correct because the underlying testimony itself does not resolve it. What can be said is that all three accounts agree on a smaller set of claims that matter more for the purposes of this script. that the reptilians are an old species, predating recorded human history by a wide margin, that they are not native in the same sense humans are to the surface of the Earth as it exists today, and that whatever their point of ultimate origin, their operational presence in human affairs has been sustained, deliberate, and long-running rather than incidental. The physical description of reptilians is remarkably stable across the testimony, far more so than the question of origin, and this consistency is part of what researchers in the field point to as evidence the underlying reports describe a real, shared referent rather than independent cultural invention. Witnesses across decades and continents describe a bipedal humanoid form, typically reported between 6 and 8 feet in height for the most commonly encountered caste, though taller individuals are reported in testimony describing higher-ranking members of the hierarchy. The skin is consistently described as scaled rather than smooth, ranging in reported coloration from a deep olive green through gray-brown to, in a smaller number of accounts, a darker near-black tone, with the scale pattern most frequently compared by witnesses to that of a crocodile or monitor lizard rather than a snake. The head is described as elongated relative to a human skull, with a pronounced brow ridge, vertically slit pupils set in eyes that witnesses across independent accounts describe as conveying an unmistakable predatory quality even at rest, and in many reports a fully or partially webbed structure between the digits of both the hands and feet. A subset of testimony, concentrated particularly among witnesses describing higher caste individuals, reports a tail, typically thick at the base and tapering, and in some accounts a ridged or finned structure running from the base of the skull down the spine, more pronounced in some reports than others, a variation researchers interpret as a caste-linked or possibly sex-linked physical marker rather than evidence of inconsistent or unreliable reporting. Internally, the testimony describes reptilian society as organized along caste lines, with movement between castes reported as rare to non-existent and caste membership tied, in the majority of accounts, to coloration and physical build, rather than achievement or merit in any sense familiar from human social structures. The warrior caste, most frequently encountered in testimony describing direct confrontation or abduction-related activity, is described as the largest and most physically imposing, typically presented in the darker end of the reported coloration range, organized along explicitly military lines with a command structure witnesses compare, where they attempt a human analogy at all, to a disciplined standing army rather than an irregular force. The worker or laborer caste, reported less frequently in direct witness testimony, but referenced consistently in accounts describing underground facility operations, is described as smaller in stature, lighter in build, and tasked with the maintenance of physical infrastructure, a role some researchers compare functionally to a managed labor class rather than a free workforce, though the testimony on this point is thinner than on the warrior caste, and should be treated with correspondingly more caution. A third caste, referred to in much of the literature simply as the priest or administrative caste, is reported far less frequently than the other two, encountered primarily in testimony describing higher-level briefings, ceremonial activity, or direct interface with the draconian hierarchy described in later sections of this script, and is consistently described as physically distinct from the other two castes, taller, more slender, and in a number of accounts displaying a paler or more golden coloration that several witnesses independently link to elevated status within the broader structure. The question of reptilian cognitive and psychological character recurs across the testimony with a consistency worth noting in its own right. Witnesses describing direct encounters, whether under hypnotic regression or in waking recall, consistently report an absence of what might be called emotional warmth or ordinary social effect, describing instead a cold, observational quality to reptilian behavior even during procedures witnesses experienced as deeply invasive or distressing. This is frequently contrasted in the same testimony with the more overtly predatory quality reported in direct confrontation. Witnesses across independent accounts describing a sense of being regarded the way a hunting animal regards prey, a description that recurs often enough and in similar enough language across unconnected sources that researchers treat it as one of the more reliable behavioral markers distinguishing reptilian encounters from those involving other reported non-human types. At the same time, a notable minority of testimony describes encounters involving what witnesses interpret as deliberate psychological manipulation rather than simple predation, including instances of witnesses reporting induced calm, suppressed resistance, or a sense of having their will directly overridden during an encounter, a pattern some researchers link to reported reptilian capacity for a form of low-range telepathic or bioenergetic influence, distinct from and generally described as less refined than the far more developed psychic capacity attributed to the insectoid race, examined later in this script. Reproduction and lifespan form another area where the testimony, though thinner than the physical description material, shows a degree of internal consistency worth recording. Multiple independent sources describe reptilian lifespans as substantially longer than human lifespans, with some testimony citing figures in the range of several centuries for members of the higher castes, a claim researchers note parallels longevity claims made about several other reported non-human types, and which, like those other claims, remains entirely unverifiable through any independent means available to investigators. On reproduction, the testimony is sparser still, with a number of sources describing reptilian reproductive biology as involving egg-laying rather than live birth, consistent with the broader reptilian physical analogy that gives the race its common name, and a smaller number of accounts describing dedicated incubation chambers, reportedly observed within underground facilities, climate-controlled rooms housing rows of large, leathery shelled eggs under what witnesses describe as constant low-level monitoring. This detail is reported with considerably less confidence and consistency than the physical description material covered earlier, and this script flags it accordingly as a thinner thread within the overall body of testimony included here because it recurs often enough across independent sources to be worth recording rather than because it carries the same evidentiary weight as the case testimony already discussed. It is worth addressing directly, at this point in the script, the question of why the reptilian or serpent form recurs so consistently across this category of testimony, given how easy it would be to dismiss the pattern as a simple cultural reflex. Humans reaching for an ancient and nearly universal fear response to snakes and reptiles as a ready-made vocabulary for describing something genuinely unfamiliar and frightening. This is a serious objection and deserves a serious answer rather than dismissal. Researchers who have examined this question point to several details in the testimony that complicate the simple cultural projection explanation. First, the physical description across independent accounts is considerably more specific and consistent than a generalized fear response would likely produce, including details like the specific webbing pattern between digits, the consistent cast-linked coloration variation, and the specific predatory quality of the eyes, details that go well beyond the generic, scaly, and frightening description a simple projection hypothesis would predict. Second, the cross-cultural mythological material examined in the introduction to this script, the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Mesoamerican, and Chinese serpent and dragon traditions associated with divine or ruling authority, predates the modern abduction literature by thousands of years, and was, in the case of several of these traditions, entirely unknown to the witnesses whose modern testimony nonetheless converges with it, a detail that is difficult to explain through any modern act of cultural borrowing, since the witnesses in question had no exposure to the ancient material their accounts independently echo. Third, and perhaps most significantly, a number of researchers in the field point out that fear-based cultural projection, if it were the true explanation, would be expected to produce far more variation across cultures with different relationships to reptiles, snake-fearing cultures producing more vivid reptilian testimony than cultures with little cultural reptile symbolism, a correlation that investigators who have examined the geographic distribution of reptilian testimony report does not hold, with consistent reptilian-type reports emerging from regions, including parts of Scandinavia and the British Isles, with comparatively little indigenous reptile presence or reptile-centered folklore to draw on. None of this constitutes proof, and this script does not claim otherwise. But it is the basis on which researchers in this field argue that the reptilian description should be taken as testimony about an actual observed physical form, rather than dismissed in advance as a predictable psychological artifact. No discussion of reptilian capability would be complete without addressing the most controversial single claim associated with this race within the broader literature: the assertion, advanced by a significant body of testimony, that certain reptilians possess the ability to assume a human or near-human appearance, either through an advanced biological or technological process witnesses describe in different accounts as shape-shifting, masking, or holographic projection. This claim deserves careful handling because it is also the claim most frequently exploited outside the serious research community to construct unfounded and often defamatory accusations against specific real individuals, a practice this script explicitly rejects and will not engage in at any point. What the underlying testimony actually describes, stripped of any application to named contemporary figures, is more bounded than its popular caricature suggests. Witnesses, primarily individuals who report sustained or repeated contact rather than single brief encounters, describe instances in which a reptilian entity present during an encounter appeared, over a period ranging from seconds to several minutes, to shift toward a more human-presenting appearance, with several accounts specifically describing a kind of visible instability or flickering at the edges of the perceived form during the transition, rather than an instantaneous or seamless change. Researchers who take this testimony seriously generally favor one of two explanatory models. The first treats it as a literal biological or technological capability, possibly involving some form of energetic field projection layered over the physical body, a capability some testimony links to the same caste of higher status, paler coloration reptilians described earlier in this section as occupying administrative or priestly roles. The second, more cautious model treats reported shapeshifting as a perceptual phenomenon, the product of an entity's psychic or bioenergetic influence on a witness's perception rather than an actual physical transformation, a model that would tie the capability to the broader pattern of psychological influence already discussed earlier in this section. This script does not resolve which model better explains the testimony and flags the entire shape-shifting claim as among the least independently verifiable elements of the reptilian case file, included here because of its prominence and consistency within the source material, not because it carries the same evidentiary weight as the physical description testimony covered earlier. The hybrid breeding claim, distinct from but frequently discussed alongside the shape-shifting material, occupies a more central and more consistently reported position in the literature. Multiple independent abduction researchers, working with separate witness populations across different decades, converged on a strikingly similar account that a long-running program exists involving the combination of reptilian and human genetic material conducted through procedures witnesses describe under hypnotic regression and, in a smaller number of cases, in direct waking recall as involving the non-consensual collection of reproductive material followed, in a subset of cases, by witnesses reporting being shown or made to interact with resulting hybrid offspring during later encounters. These hybrid individuals are described with notable consistency across independent sources, generally humanoid in overall proportion and closer to human in scale than full reptilian individuals, but retaining subtler reptilian features, including a fine scale pattern visible primarily on the scalp and along the forearms, a slightly elongated skull, and eyes that, while more rounded and human in overall shape than the full reptilian eye, retain a faint vertical narrowing of the pupil under direct light. Witnesses who report extended contact with these hybrid individuals frequently describe an emotional ambiguity in the encounters, a number of accounts noting that the hybrids appeared, in the witness's perception, to display more recognizable affect and curiosity toward the human witness than the full reptilians present during the same encounters, a detail some researchers interpret as evidence the hybridization program is oriented, at least in part, toward producing individuals capable of more effective integration into human society, whether for purposes of long-term population monitoring, as several sources suggest, or for reasons the testimony does not clearly specify. The geographic and demographic distribution of reptilian-specific testimony is itself worth a brief note because it bears on the credibility assessment researchers apply to the broader body of reports. Unlike gray-type abduction testimony, which shows a heavy concentration in North America, particularly in the years following the well-publicized cases of the 1960s and 1970s that shaped early public awareness of the phenomenon, reptilian-specific testimony shows a markedly more even global distribution. Significant case clusters have been documented and investigated by regional researchers in South America, particularly Brazil and Argentina, in parts of Eastern Europe, in Australia, and in the United Kingdom, frequently predating any significant cross-cultural media exposure that might explain the consistency through simple imitation. Researchers point to this even distribution as a meaningful data point in favor of treating the testimony as describing a genuinely global phenomenon rather than a culturally bounded one specific to American popular culture, since the physical description, details, the caste structure, and even specific behavioral patterns like the reported cold predatory effect recur across these geographically separated case clusters with a consistency that would be difficult to produce through cultural transmission alone, particularly in cases investigated and documented before the relevant testimony from other regions had been published or translated. The final element of the foundational picture concerns reptilian technology, a subject on which the testimony is, again, less detailed than the physical and behavioral material already covered, but consistent enough to summarize here before moving into the operational material that follows in the next section. Witnesses across multiple independent accounts describe reptilian craft as generally smaller and more utilitarian in design than the more frequently photographed disc-shaped craft associated with other reported non-human types, with several sources describing an angular, almost insectile vehicle architecture used specifically for short-range terrestrial and subterranean transport rather than long-distance interstellar travel, a detail that fits with the broader testimony examined in the next section describing reptilians as a heavily terrestrially embedded presence operating substantially through underground infrastructure rather than primarily through orbital or surface-based activity. A smaller number of accounts describe a second, larger class of vessel, generally reported only by witnesses describing higher caste encounters, with a more elongated, segmented hull structure that several witnesses compared independently to the body plan of the entities themselves, and which testimony associates with longer range travel, possibly including travel between Earth and whatever off-world base of operations the higher reptilian castes are alleged to maintain. Energy weaponry is referenced in a smaller number of accounts, generally described in terms too vague to support detailed analysis. Handheld devices producing a localized paralytic or incapacitating effect on human witnesses, described consistently enough across sources to suggest a real underlying reference point, but without the kind of technical specificity that would allow meaningful comparison to known human weapons systems. This script does not attempt to extrapolate beyond what the testimony itself actually claims on this point, and treats the technological material throughout as the least developed and most speculative portion of the overall reptilian case file. A case frequently cited by researchers as representative of the broader reptilian testimony pattern, drawn from case files compiled by independent investigators and presented here without identifying details at the request of the original witness, involves a former municipal utility worker in the southwestern United States who reported in the late 1980s a period of missing time following an encounter on a remote service road during a night shift. Under subsequent hypnotic regression conducted independently by two separate investigators who did not compare notes until after both sessions were complete, the witness described being led, against his initial resistance, into a small craft by a tall, dark-scaled figure he estimated at close to 7 feet in height, with a description of the eyes, the webbed hand structure, and the cold affect of the entity matching, in granular detail, descriptions given independently by other witnesses in unconnected cases the investigators later cross-referenced. The witness described a brief examination procedure, the insertion of a small instrument into the nasal cavity that left a physical mark subsequently photographed and examined by a physician unaffiliated with either investigator, and a final stage of the encounter in which a second, paler entity entered the chamber and appeared to communicate directly with the first, using a vocalization the witness could not consciously process, but which left him, in his own words, recorded in both independent sessions, with a residual and specific sense of having been evaluated and catalogued rather than studied for general curiosity. Cases of this structure, examination, physical marking, a clear caste distinction between participating entities, and a residual sense of bureaucratic rather than exploratory intent recur with enough frequency across the broader case file literature that researchers treat this particular witness's account not as an isolated anomaly, but as one well-documented example among a substantial cluster of structurally similar reports. Population scale is one of the more difficult questions the testimony attempts to address, and the available estimates vary widely enough that this script presents them with considerable caution. A small number of more detailed whistleblower accounts, generally from individuals describing backgrounds in classified defense or intelligence work, offer specific figures, in some cases citing estimates in the low millions for the total reptilian population believed to maintain a presence in proximity to Earth, organized across a network of underground facilities whose existence these same sources describe in some detail. These figures cannot be independently verified through any means available to outside researchers, and this script does not present them as established fact. What is more broadly corroborated across a wider range of sources with less specific numerical claims is the general picture of a substantial, organized, multi-generational presence rather than a small or transient one, sufficient in scale to maintain the kind of sustained genetic, infrastructural, and monitoring activity described throughout the broader testimony. Several sources describe this population as organized into a network of large subterranean population centers rather than a single central base, with individual facilities described in terms ranging from research and breeding installations of relatively modest size to what a smaller number of more elaborate accounts describe as full underground cities, housing populations in the tens of thousands, complete with infrastructure for food production, manufacturing, and what multiple sources describe, without much elaboration, as advanced energy generation. The most frequently cited of these alleged facilities within North American testimony is examined in detail in the next section of this script, alongside the broader pattern of alleged joint human-reptilian underground operations. A second case, drawn from South American case files compiled independently of the North American material already discussed and investigated by a regional researcher with no contact with the investigators in the prior case, offers a useful point of cross-cultural comparison. A rural landowner in the Argentine interior reported in the early 1990s a daylight encounter on his own property involving two entities he described, without any prompting toward the terminology used in North American or European literature, he had no exposure to as lizard men, a description that included the same webbed hand structure, the same vertically slit pupil, and the same caste-linked coloration distinction between the two entities present, one darker and more heavily built, the other paler and more slender, that recurs throughout the broader case file. The witness, who experienced no period of missing time and recalled the encounter in full waking consciousness without any hypnotic intervention, described the paler entity attempting what he interpreted as a calming gesture before both entities withdrew toward a small craft that departed the property at a low altitude, observed independently by a second family member who had not yet been informed of what the first witness had seen. Cases of this kind, brief, daylight, involving no missing time, and corroborated by a second independent witness, are treated by researchers as a particularly valuable subset of the broader literature, precisely because they remove several of the methodological objections, reliance on hypnosis, single witness reporting, raised against the larger body of more elaborate abduction testimony, while still converging on the same physical description and caste structure detailed throughout this section. The relationship between the reptilian castes described throughout this section and the Alpha-Draconian race, examined in detail later in this script, deserves a brief preview here, since it bears directly on how the the priest or administrative caste should be understood. Across a significant portion of the source material, this paler, taller, higher status reptilian caste is described not as occupying the absolute top of the hierarchy in its own right, but as functioning as the primary interface between the broader reptilian population and a smaller, more powerful ruling presence described in terms that, as the next sections of this script will show, align closely with the separately reported Alpha-Draconian race. Several witnesses who report contact with this priest caste specifically describe an unmistakable shift in deference and behavior on the rare occasions a still more imposing entity, winged in a number of these accounts, entered the same setting, a detail that becomes significantly more important once the draconian material is examined directly in the sections that follow. Taken together, this foundational material, origin, physiology, caste structure, behavioral pattern, and technological footprint establishes the species this script now turns to examine in operational terms. What the testimony says the reptilians have actually been doing on Earth across the span of recorded human history and into the present day. The next section moves into that material directly, beginning with the alleged historical infiltration of early human civilization and continuing through to the modern control and genetic programs that constitute the central allegation against this race within the broader hostile contact literature. Reptilians, agenda, underground bases, and historical infiltration. Having established what the testimony says the reptilians are, this section turns to the more difficult and more consequential question, what the testimony says they have actually been doing. Three threads run through the literature on this point, consistently enough across independent sources that researchers treat them as the three pillars of the alleged reptilian agenda. The first concerns resource and energy extraction, both biological and, according to a smaller but persistent body of testimony, a more exotic form of extraction tied to human emotional and psychic states. The second concerns the maintenance of a vast and deliberately concealed underground infrastructure spanning multiple continents, allegedly used for everything from breeding operations to joint research conducted in cooperation with elements of human government. The third, and the most historically rooted of the three, concerns a long arc of infiltration into human civilization, stretching back to its earliest written records, an alleged pattern of influence over ruling structures, religious institutions, and systems of governance that researchers in this field describe as continuous rather than episodic, a presence that never fully withdrew after the ancient period, but instead adapted its methods as human civilization itself changed. The genetic and biological extraction thread builds directly on material introduced in the previous section, the hybridization program described by multiple independent researchers involving the systematic, non-consensual collection of human reproductive material across generations of the same family lines in a significant number of documented cases, is described in the testimony not as an isolated research project, but as a coordinated, multi-generational breeding program with a specific stated objective: the production of a stable hybrid lineage capable of functioning within human society while retaining traits useful to whatever broader purpose the program serves. Several of the most detailed accounts in the literature describe abductees reporting repeated contact across their own lifetimes, often beginning in early childhood and continuing into adulthood, with a pattern of escalating involvement that researchers interpret as evidence the program tracks specific genetic lines across multiple generations rather than selecting subjects at random. This detail, multi-generational tracking of the same family lines, recurs across independent case files compiled by separate researchers working with separate witness populations on different continents, a convergence that lends the broader hybridization claim more weight than it would carry as an isolated assertion from a single source. A second and more contested extraction claim, present in a smaller portion of the literature but persistent enough to warrant inclusion here, concerns what some researchers describe using the term psychic or energetic harvesting, the proposition that sustained states of human fear, distress, and negative emotional arousal generate a form of usable energy or resource that certain non-human intelligences, the reptilian caste prominent among them, are alleged to actively cultivate and extract. This idea draws on a concept that surfaced independently in altered state and out-of-body experience research conducted by figures unconnected to the abduction literature, who described observing what they termed a kind of energetic byproduct of intense human emotion that appeared in their accounts to be actively sought out by certain non-physical or non-human presences. Proponents of this theory within the reptilian literature argue it offers an explanation for an otherwise puzzling pattern in the abduction testimony: the apparent indifference, in many reported encounters, to whether a procedure causes the human subject distress, even in cases where distress appears to serve no obvious clinical or genetic purpose, and in a smaller number of more troubling accounts, instances where witnesses report a clear impression that their fear response itself was being monitored or in some sense consumed. This script presents this thread of testimony with the appropriate caution it deserves as among the most speculative and least independently corroborated claims associated with the reptilian agenda, included here because of its recurrence within the source literature, rather than because it carries the same evidentiary standing as the more material genetic and infrastructural claims that form the bulk of this section. A specific case frequently cited in connection with this energetic extraction theory involves a woman in the northeastern United States who, across a series of independent therapeutic sessions conducted over several years by a clinician with no prior involvement in abduction research, described a recurring pattern of encounters beginning in adolescence in which she experienced what she described as orchestrated emotional distress, scenarios that, under hypnotic recall, she came to interpret as deliberately constructed by her alleged captors rather than naturally occurring, including induced experiences of false danger to family members that she later determined, upon waking, had no basis in reality. The clinician involved in this case, who published a clinical account of the sessions under a pseudonym for the witness to protect her privacy, noted in her own professional assessment that the witness displayed no underlying psychiatric history that would account for confabulation of this specificity and consistency across sessions conducted months apart, and that the witness's physiological responses during recall, monitored using standard clinical measures, were consistent with genuine traumatic memory recall rather than invented narrative. Cases of this structure, recurring across multiple independent therapeutic and research contexts, though never in large numbers, form the empirical core of what remains, even by the standards of this already speculative body of testimony, one of the more difficult claims in the reptilian literature to evaluate with confidence. The underground infrastructure thread is, by contrast, among the more extensively and specifically documented elements of the reptilian case file, anchored by a single location that recurs across more independent testimony than any other alleged facility in the literature. A remote area near Dulce, New Mexico, close to the Colorado border, repeatedly described across decades of separate witness accounts as the site of a vast multi-level underground installation operated jointly by reptilian forces and elements of the United States government and military. The Dulce testimony has a specific origin point that distinguishes it from more diffuse abduction literature. In the mid-1980s, a man identifying himself as a former security technician at the facility, who has never been definitively identified by independent investigators despite extensive effort, came forward with detailed claims describing an installation he stated extended at least 7 levels beneath the surface, housing, according to his account, a combination of advanced human and non-human research, biological storage and processing areas he described in deeply disturbing terms, and direct ongoing collaboration between reptilian personnel and a compartmentalized faction within American defense and intelligence circles. The witness described what he characterized as a catastrophic breakdown in this collaboration sometime in the period he was describing, an armed confrontation between human security personnel and reptilian forces inside the facility that resulted, by his account, in significant loss of life on the human side, an event that, if it occurred as described, would represent one of the most consequential and most thoroughly suppressed incidents in the entire body of testimony this script draws on. This script treats the Dulce testimony with particular care because it occupies an unusual position in the literature, more specific and more elaborate than almost any other single source, yet also more difficult to independently corroborate. Given that its central witness has never been conclusively identified, the facility's existence has never been officially acknowledged, and much of the supporting detail rests on the testimony of a small number of secondary witnesses whose own claims are difficult to verify through conventional means. What can be said with more confidence is that the broader pattern the Dulce testimony describes, a network of deep underground military facilities constructed across the United States, beginning in the post-war period, using tunnel boring technology and funding levels that several independent investigators, including individuals describing backgrounds in geological survey and federal contracting work, have argued exceed what publicly acknowledged infrastructure projects can account for, is corroborated by a wider and more conventional body of evidence than the specific reptilian collaboration claim. Whether these facilities, to the extent they exist as described, in fact house the kind of joint human-reptilian operation the Dulce whistleblower described, or whether that specific element of the testimony represents an embellishment, a deliberate disinformation effort, or a genuine misidentification of unrelated classified human activity, remains, in the most honest assessment this script can offer, an open question rather than a settled one. It is included here, at this length, because of its centrality to the broader literature and the volume of secondary testimony that continues to reference it, not because this script regards the underlying claim as proven. The secondary testimony surrounding Dulce, while never resolving the core question of the original witness's identity, has accumulated steadily across the decades since the claims first surfaced, and a brief survey of its character is useful for understanding why the case continues to anchor so much of the broader underground-based literature. A separate individual, identifying himself by a different name and describing a background in security consulting rather than direct facility employment, came forward independently in the early 1990s with claims that partially corroborated the original account, including a similar description of the facility's general layout and a consistent description of the alleged 1979 confrontation, though this second witness's account diverged from the original on several specific details, a divergence researchers in the field treat with appropriate caution, noting that it could indicate either an independent corroborating source describing the same underlying reality from a different vantage point, or a second-hand account constructed with awareness of the original testimony and embellished accordingly. A third and more tangential body of supporting material comes from a small number of residents in the immediate area surrounding the alleged facility site, who independently reported, across a period spanning several decades and without apparent coordination with either named whistleblower, unusual ground vibration, unexplained livestock mutilation incidents consistent with patterns reported near other alleged underground facilities elsewhere in North America, and on a small number of occasions, direct visual sightings of unconventional aerial activity concentrated specifically over the area in question rather than distributed randomly across the wider region. None of this secondary material constitutes independent proof of the central claim. It does establish that the Dulce testimony, whatever its ultimate truth, has generated a body of geographically concentrated, multi-decade, multi-witness secondary reporting that exceeds what most isolated or fabricated claims in this field typically produce, which is part of why researchers continue to treat the case as worthy of serious examination rather than dismissal. Beyond Dulce, a smaller number of other locations recur across the underground-based testimony, with enough independent corroboration to merit brief mention. A facility beneath the area surrounding Pine Gap in Central Australia, officially acknowledged as a joint United States-Australian signals intelligence installation, is described in a separate body of testimony, distinct from and apparently uninfluenced by the American Dulce material, as housing additional levels beyond its publicly acknowledged function, with several Australian witnesses independently describing encounters and sightings in the surrounding region, consistent in physical description with the broader reptilian testimony already examined. A second cluster of testimony, originating primarily from Eastern European sources and concentrated in the years following the collapse of Soviet-era secrecy in the early 1990s, describes a separate network of underground facilities in the Ural Mountains region, with witness accounts describing a structurally similar pattern of joint human-non-human operation, though the specific entities described in this body of testimony are reported with less physical detail than the North American material, and should be treated as a thinner and less independently verified thread within the broader underground-based literature. Turning to the historical infiltration thread, the testimony here draws less on direct contact reports and more on comparative analysis of ancient textual and archaeological material, examined in light of the broader contact hypothesis already introduced in the first section of this script. The starting point most frequently cited by researchers in this tradition is ancient Sumer, the earliest literate civilization in the historical record, whose cuneiform tablets describe a class of beings called the Anunnaki, a term most directly translated as those who from the heavens to earth came. Sumerian text describes the Anunnaki not as distant gods observed from afar, but as direct, physically present rulers, organized in a defined hierarchy with named individual figures who are credited in the original Sumerian material with the foundation of organized agriculture, the construction of the earliest cities, and the establishment of the legal and administrative codes that would shape Mesopotamian civilization for the next 3,000 years. Researchers who advance the reptilian-Anunnaki connection point to several details in the original textual material as significant. Serpent imagery associated repeatedly with the highest tier of the Anunnaki hierarchy, particularly with a figure named in the tablets as Enki, frequently depicted in surviving Mesopotamian iconography in serpent or serpent-associated form, and credited in the same textual tradition with the genetic creation or modification of early humanity itself, an act the original tablets describe in terms strikingly consistent, proponents argue, with the modern hybridization testimony already examined in this script. This script presents this comparative reading as exactly that, a comparative reading, advanced by a specific school of researchers within the ancient astronaut and ancient contact research tradition, rather than as a settled consensus interpretation of Sumerian textual material, which remains a subject of ongoing and often contentious debate even among conventional Assyriologists working entirely outside the extraterrestrial contact framework. The Egyptian thread, touched on briefly in the introduction to this script, deserves fuller treatment here. Beyond the uraeus, the rearing serpent worn at the brow of every pharaoh as the central symbol of royal authority, researchers point to a broader pattern in Egyptian religious and dynastic material, the consistent association of the earliest dynastic rulers with divine descent from a serpent or dragon-associated source, preserved in fragmentary form in the work of the Egyptian priest Manetho, whose now lost original history, surviving only through later quotation and summary, described a sequence of god-kings ruling Egypt for a span of time vastly exceeding any conventional chronology, prior to the establishment of the historically attested First Dynasty. Proponents of the reptilian infiltration hypothesis read this material as a garbled but genuine historical memory of an actual non-human ruling presence in the deepest layer of Egyptian prehistory, a presence whose direct physical involvement faded over subsequent millennia, while its symbolic and ritual legacy, the serpent crown, the emphasis on bloodline purity within the royal family, maintained through practices including sibling marriage among the ruling dynasty, a practice with few parallels elsewhere in the ancient world, persisted as the institutional residue of that earlier, more direct relationship. This pattern of bloodline-centered ruling authority, preserved through specific marriage and succession practices designed to maintain a claimed unbroken line of descent from a divine or semi-divine founding source, recurs across a number of ancient and classical civilizations beyond Egypt, and researchers in this field treat its recurrence as a structural echo of the same underlying phenomenon rather than coincidence. It is important to be precise about what this script is and is not claiming at this point. The historical pattern under discussion concerns ancient and long-extinct ruling dynasties, figures and institutions separated from the present by thousands of years, and the comparative analysis offered here makes no claim whatsoever about any specific living individual, family, or institution operating in the present day. This script explicitly declines to extend the ancient bloodline material into modern attribution of any kind, a practice common in less careful treatments of this subject that this script regards as both evidentially unsupportable and unfair to the real people such claims are typically directed at. What the testimony and comparative material actually support at the level of rigor this script holds itself to is a claim about the ancient world that multiple early civilizations, with limited to no contact with one another, independently developed ruling structures organized around a claimed serpent or dragon-associated divine descent, maintained through specific institutional practices designed to preserve that claimed lineage across generations. Whether this reflects an actual historical non-human ruling presence, as proponents of the contact hypothesis argue, or a parallel and independent symbolic development across unconnected human cultures, as more conventional historians and anthropologists argue, remains genuinely unresolved, and this script presents both possibilities without claiming to settle the matter. The final element of the historical infiltration thread concerns the alleged transition from direct, visible rule in the ancient period to a more concealed mode of influence in the historical and modern eras, a transition the testimony attributes to changing strategic conditions rather than any reduction in underlying presence or intent. Researchers in this tradition argue that as human population, technological capability, and political organization grew more complex over the centuries following the ancient period, direct and visible non-human rule became increasingly impractical to sustain, prompting a shift toward indirect influence exercised through human institutions, religious, financial, and governmental, rather than through open non-human presence at the apex of any single state. This claim, by its nature, is considerably harder to evaluate than the ancient material already discussed, since it concerns ongoing and largely covert activity rather than a documented and closed historical period, and the testimony supporting it is correspondingly thinner and more dependent on the more general whistleblower and underground base material already examined in this section than on any specific independently verifiable case. What can be said is that this transition narrative, direct ancient rule giving way to indirect modern influence exercised through human proxy institutions, forms the connective tissue between the ancient material examined here and the modern operational testimony, abduction patterns, government collusion claims, and direct contact case studies that the next and final section of the reptilian portion of this script will examine in detail, bringing the historical and the contemporary threads of the reptilian case file together before this script turns to the Alpha-Draconian hierarchy described throughout the preceding material as standing above the reptilian structure already detailed. Reptilians, testimonies, government collusion, and closing case studies. The preceding two sections established what the testimony says reptilians are and what the testimony says they want. This final section on the reptilian race turns to the witnesses themselves, examining the patterns that emerge when their accounts are studied in aggregate, the specific and more contested claims of direct government collusion that recur throughout the literature, and a small number of detailed case studies presented at greater length than the briefer examples already touched on in earlier sections, before closing out the reptilian portion of this script and turning to the Alpha-Draconian hierarchy in the section that follows. When researchers in this field aggregate reptilian-specific abduction testimony across the decades of case files now available, several statistical patterns emerge with enough consistency to be treated as meaningful rather than coincidental. The first concerns timing. Reported encounters cluster disproportionately in the hours between approximately 2 and 4 in the morning, a pattern so consistent across independent case files that several investigators have proposed it reflects a deliberate operational choice on the part of those conducting the alleged activity timed to coincide with the deepest phase of human sleep and the period of lowest likelihood of third-party observation, rather than reflecting any artifact of witness memory or reporting bias, since the same pattern holds regardless of whether the testimony was recovered through hypnosis or recalled consciously without intervention. The second concerns recurrence. A substantial proportion of detailed reptilian case files, in some compiled samples exceeding half of all reported cases, describe not a single isolated encounter, but a pattern of repeated contact extending across years, or, in a meaningful number of cases, across the witness's entire lifetime, often beginning in early childhood, a detail that connects directly to the multi-generational genetic tracking claim examined in the previous section. The third concerns family clustering, the repeated finding across independent investigators working in different regions that detailed abduction testimony tends to appear not as an isolated phenomenon within a single individual, but distributed across multiple members of the same extended family, parents, and children, and in a smaller number of particularly well-documented cases across 3 consecutive generations, a pattern researchers argue would be considerably harder to produce through simple psychological suggestion or cultural contagion than a genuinely random distribution of claims would predict. The question of direct government collusion represents the most contested layer of the entire reptilian literature, and this script has already flagged in the introduction the need for particular caution when handling this category of claim. It deserves a fuller and more careful treatment here, both because of its prominence in the broader field, and because an honest documentary treatment cannot simply omit material this central to the popular understanding of the subject. The foundational claim in this thread concerns a body known in the literature by the designation Majestic 12, alleged in a body of leaked and disputed documents first surfacing in the mid-1980s to have been a secret committee established by presidential authority in the immediate aftermath of the 1947 Roswell incident, tasked with managing the government's response to recovered non-human technology and, according to the more elaborate versions of this claim, with overseeing subsequent contact and negotiation with non-human intelligences. The authenticity of the core Majestic 12 documents has never been established to the satisfaction of independent forensic document examiners, several of whom have identified specific anachronisms in formatting, signature, and bureaucratic language inconsistent with authentic documents of the claimed period. Findings that lead the more skeptical wing of researchers in this field to treat the entire body of material as a fabrication, whether produced as deliberate disinformation by a government agency seeking to muddy the broader field, or as an independent hoax by individuals within the research community itself. This script does not resolve that question because the underlying forensic evidence genuinely points in both directions depending on which specific document within the broader Majestic 12 corpus is being examined, and presents the material here as a claim under active dispute rather than as established testimony with the same standing as the witness-based material examined elsewhere in this script. A related but distinct strand of the collusion testimony concerns the proposition that a formal or informal exchange relationship was established between elements of the United States government and reptilian representatives at some point in the mid-20th century, frequently described in the more detailed versions of this testimony as involving an exchange of advanced technology for permission to conduct limited biological research on the human population, an arrangement researchers within this tradition describe using the term treaty, while acknowledging that no document corresponding to a conventional treaty has ever been produced or verified. The testimony supporting this claim is sourced overwhelmingly from self-described former defense, intelligence, and aerospace contractor personnel, speaking in most cases either anonymously or under conditions of partial identification, describing briefings, compartmentalized programs, and in a smaller number of cases, direct observation of joint facilities consistent with the underground base material already examined in the previous section. The evidentiary weight of this category of testimony varies considerably from source to source. A small number of these witnesses have submitted to independent polygraph examination, with results in several documented cases assessed by the examining professional as consistent with truthful testimony regarding the witness's own belief in the events described. Though polygraph examination, it should be noted plainly, measures physiological stress response rather than objective truth, and cannot distinguish between an account that is factually accurate and one the witness sincerely but mistakenly believes to be accurate. A larger number of these witnesses have offered no comparable corroboration beyond the consistency of their account with the broader body of testimony already examined throughout this script. And this script treats that consistency as worth noting without treating it as proof, since a popular and internally coherent body of claims circulating within a defined research community can produce convergent secondary testimony through familiarity with existing material as easily as through independent first-hand experience. A methodological problem this entire field has never fully resolved and that this script does not claim to resolve here. A related but distinct strand of the collusion testimony concerns the proposition that a formal or informal exchange relationship was established between elements of the United States government and reptilian representatives at some point in the mid-20th century, frequently described in the more detailed versions of this testimony as involving an exchange of advanced technology for permission to conduct limited biological research on the human population. An arrangement researchers within this tradition describe using the term treaty while acknowledging that no document corresponding to a conventional treaty has ever been produced or verified. The testimony supporting this claim is sourced overwhelmingly from self-described former defense, intelligence, and aerospace contractor personnel, speaking in most cases either anonymously or under conditions of partial identification, describing briefings, compartmentalized programs, and in a smaller number of cases, direct observation of joint facilities consistent with the underground base material already examined in the previous section. The evidentiary weight of this category of testimony varies considerably from source to source. A small number of these witnesses have submitted to independent polygraph examination, with results in several documented cases assessed by the examining professional as consistent with truthful testimony regarding the witness's own belief in the events described. Though polygraph examination, it should be noted plainly, measures physiological stress response rather than objective truth, and cannot distinguish between an account that is factually accurate and one the witness sincerely but mistakenly believes to be accurate. A larger number of these witnesses have offered no comparable corroboration beyond the consistency of their account with the broader body of testimony already examined throughout this script, and this script treats that consistency as worth noting without treating it as proof, since a popular and internally coherent body of claims circulating within a defined research community can produce convergent secondary testimony through familiarity with existing material as easily as through independent first-hand experience, a methodological problem this entire field has never fully resolved and that this script does not claim to resolve here. Within this same collusion thread, a smaller number of sources describe a more specific and more elaborate claim, sometimes referred to in the literature as a personnel exchange program, in which a limited number of human military or scientific personnel are alleged to have been transferred voluntarily, according to some versions of the testimony, and under considerably more coercive circumstances, according to others, to non-human facilities or vessels for extended observation, training, or diplomatic purposes, with a small number of these individuals allegedly returning to conventional human life years later under strict secrecy obligations. This claim represents one of the most elaborate and least independently verifiable threads in the entire body of testimony this script examines, resting on the uncorroborated statements of a very small number of named and unnamed sources whose claims have not been substantiated by any documentary or physical evidence available to outside researchers. This script includes it here only because of its persistent presence within the broader collusion literature, flagged explicitly as the weakest category of claim discussed in this section, included for completeness rather than because it meets the evidentiary bar applied to the witness testimony and case study material that forms the substantive core of this script. The psychological and physiological toll this body of testimony describes deserves direct treatment before turning to the detailed case studies that close out this section, because it is easy, in a survey of this kind, to discuss abduction testimony as an abstract evidentiary category while losing sight of what the witnesses themselves describe living with. Clinicians who have worked extensively with self-identified abductees, building on the foundational work of John Mack referenced in the introduction to this script, describe a consistent clinical picture, symptoms closely resembling post-traumatic stress disorder, including intrusive recollection, hyperarousal, and a marked disruption to sleep that in a number of documented cases persisted for years following the most recent reported encounter, present in patients with no other identifiable trauma history, sufficient to explain symptoms of this severity through conventional clinical means. What distinguishes this population from a typical trauma cohort, according to the clinicians who have studied it most closely, is the frequent coexistence of this distress with a parallel and sometimes contradictory thread of meaning-making. A significant number of long-term experiencers, particularly those who have engaged with peer support communities of other self-identified abductees that began forming in the United States and United Kingdom from the late 1980s onward, describe arriving over time at a framework that allows them to integrate the experience into a broader sense of purpose or cosmic significance, even while the underlying physiological distress symptoms persist largely unchanged. Researchers in the field have debated at length whether this meaning-making represents a healthy, adaptive response to an objectively traumatic experience, a defensive psychological construction protecting against the alternative of unprocessed terror, or, in the more skeptical reading, evidence that the support community itself shapes and reinforces an internally consistent narrative regardless of the experience's ultimate origin. This script does not resolve that clinical debate, and notes only that the consistency of the underlying distress symptoms across a population with no shared prior contact, many of whom report having initially sought clinical help for unexplained sleep disturbance or anxiety, with no conscious memory of an abduction-related cause, predating any engagement with abduction-specific support communities or literature, is treated by the clinicians most closely involved with this population as a meaningful data point in favor of treating the underlying experience as real in some clinically significant sense, whatever its ultimate metaphysical explanation turns out to be. A further physiological thread, distinct from but related to the psychological material just discussed, concerns the physical evidence reported in a subset of cases, independent of any hypnotic or therapeutic intervention. Small scars, frequently described as appearing overnight with no corresponding memory of injury, subdermal anomalies subsequently detected through conventional medical imaging in a number of documented cases, and in a smaller number of more extensively investigated instances, small foreign objects surgically removed and submitted for independent laboratory analysis. The results of this analysis, where it has been conducted by laboratories without prior involvement in or sympathy toward the abduction research field, have in most documented cases identified the objects as consisting of ordinary biological or mineral material, calcified tissue, common metallic fragments, results that skeptical investigators argue close the question entirely. Proponents of the broader testimony respond that a negative result on object composition does not by itself explain how the object came to be embedded in the tissue in the first place, particularly in cases where the surrounding tissue showed no scarring consistent with conventional injury or surgical insertion through normal means, a forensic detail that has been noted in a small number of cases by the examining physicians themselves, none of whom were affiliated with abduction research organizations at the time of the original examination. This remains, as with several other threads examined in this section, a genuinely contested area where the physical evidence available is suggestive without being conclusive in either direction, and this script presents it accordingly. Then the briefer examples touched on earlier in this script, selected because researchers in the field regard them as among the more thoroughly investigated and cross-corroborated cases available, while still carrying the inherent limitations already discussed throughout this script regarding the broader evidentiary standard this material can be held to. The first case involves a retired non-commissioned officer with a documented 22-year career in a Western European National Air Force who came forward in the early 2000s, well after the end of his military service, describing a series of encounters that began during an assignment to a remote radar installation in the late 1970s. According to his testimony, corroborated in its broad outline by two former colleagues from the same installation who were independently interviewed by the researcher who first investigated the case, unidentified aerial activity was observed over the facility on multiple occasions across a period of several months, activity that on at least two occasions coincided with brief but complete failures of the installation's radar and communication systems. Failures, the witness stated, were never satisfactorily explained in the facility's own internal incident reporting and were, in his account, actively discouraged from further investigation by personnel he believed to be operating outside the normal facility chain of command. The witness's personal encounter, which he stated he had never previously discussed even with his corroborating colleagues prior to the researcher's investigation, involved a period of several hours of missing time following a solo perimeter patrol, recovered in fragmentary form through conscious recall over the following years, rather than through hypnosis, which the witness stated he specifically declined to undergo due to professional skepticism about the technique's reliability, a detail researchers in the field regard as strengthening rather than weakening the account's credibility, given the methodological concerns already discussed earlier in this script. The recovered fragments describe a directly confrontational encounter with two entities matching the physical description established earlier in this section, including the characteristic vertically slit pupil and webbed digit structure, an encounter the witness described as involving a clear and specific sense of territorial challenge on the part of the entities rather than any indication of scientific or exploratory interest, a behavioral pattern distinct from the more clinical, examination-focused encounters that dominate the broader case file literature, and which the original investigating researcher flagged as worth particular attention precisely because of that distinction, suggesting either a different operational context, a security or perimeter defense function, rather than a genetic research function, or a different caste of reptilian entity entirely, consistent with the warrior caste described in the physiology material examined earlier in this script. The second case involves a multi-generational family in the southeastern United States, investigated independently by two separate research teams over a period spanning more than 15 years, in which detailed and broadly consistent abduction testimony was eventually documented across 3 generations of the same family line, beginning with a grandmother who first reported encounters in the early 1960s, well before the broader cultural awareness of the abduction phenomenon had developed to the point where her account could plausibly be explained as imitation of existing popular material, continuing through her daughter, who began reporting independent encounters in the 1980s after initially expressing skepticism about her mother's accounts, and extending to 2 of the daughter's own children, whose earliest reported encounters were documented by the investigating researchers in real time during the children's adolescence, rather than reconstructed after the fact through adult recall. Across all 3 generations, independently interviewed, and in the case of the 2 research teams involved, investigated without full knowledge of each other's findings until a later comparative review was conducted, the physical description testimony converged consistently with the broader case file material already established throughout this section, and each generation reported similar markings, a small but consistent scar pattern on the inner forearm that a consulting physician involved in the later stages of the investigation noted bore close physical similarity across all 3 generations, despite no family member recalling how or when the marks had originally appeared. The investigating researchers, in their published findings, treated this case as among the strongest available evidence for the multi-generational genetic tracking hypothesis discussed earlier in this script, precisely because of the real-time documentation of the youngest generation's reports, which removed much of the retrospective reconstruction concern that complicates evaluation of older, single-generation case material. Taken together, the statistical patterns, the contested but persistent collusion testimony, and the two detailed case studies examined in this section complete the picture this script set out to establish regarding the reptilian race, an old, terrestrially embedded, caste-organized species whose alleged activity on Earth spans the entirety of recorded human history, whose modern operational footprint centers on genetic appropriation conducted through a sustained multi-generational program, and whose relationship to elements of human government, where the testimony can be evaluated with any confidence at all, appears to involve at minimum a pattern of institutional awareness and concealment, and at maximum, according to the more contested but persistent thread of whistleblower testimony, a degree of direct and ongoing cooperation extending back to the earliest years of the modern nuclear age. What remains unaddressed, and what the next section of this script turns to directly, is the question this material has gestured toward throughout: whether the reptilians, for all the scale and sophistication the testimony attributes to them, in fact occupy the top of the hierarchy they are alleged to operate within, or whether, as a separate and equally extensive body of testimony argues, they answer to a still older, still more powerful presence whose name recurs throughout the most detailed accounts examined so far: a winged draconian race operating from a point of origin in the Alpha-Draconis system, to which this script now turns its full attention. Alpha-Draconians, origins, hierarchy, and the elder race testimony. The preceding 4 sections of this script have built a cumulative picture of the reptilian phenomenon as it presents in the available testimony, a species described as ancient, organized, and operationally active on Earth across timescales that dwarf the entirety of recorded human civilization, conducting what the witnesses most closely involved describe as a sustained and multi-generational program of biological intervention underwritten in the most contested strands of the literature by an institutional relationship with elements of human governance that has never been fully disclosed to the public. That picture, however, as the closing paragraphs of the previous section signaled, is not self-contained. A separate, extensive, and in certain respects, even more elaborate body of testimony insists that the reptilian entities examined in this script's preceding sections do not represent the apex of the non-human hierarchy the broader literature describes, but rather a middle stratum of that hierarchy, one that is itself subject to direction, oversight, and in some versions of the testimony, coercive control from an older and more powerful presence whose characteristics, origins, and alleged relationship to both the reptilian entities and to humanity constitute the subject of this section and the 2 that follow it. The designation most consistently applied to this presence in the research literature is the Alpha-Draconian Race, a label derived from the claimed stellar origin that recurs across otherwise independent streams of testimony, the Alpha-Draconis star system, known in conventional astronomy as Thuban, a star in the constellation Draco that served as the northern pole star during the period of ancient Egyptian civilization due to the precession of the Earth's rotational axis, a coincidence that researchers within this tradition regard as potentially significant rather than incidental, given the frequency with which Egyptian iconographic and architectural traditions appear as reference points in the broader body of non-human contact testimony already touched on in earlier sections of this script. The claimed stellar origin is, like all such claims examined in this script, unverifiable through any means currently available to independent researchers, and this script presents it as a recurrent element of witness testimony rather than as an established fact about the entities it describes, a distinction that applies with equal force to every specific claim examined in this section and the 2 that follow. What the testimony does establish, with a consistency across independent sources that the more empirically minded researchers in this field treat as its primary evidentiary value, is a set of physical and behavioral characteristics attributed to the Alpha-Draconian entities that distinguish them clearly and markedly from the reptilian entities examined in the preceding sections, to a degree that the witnesses themselves, including a number who claim direct exposure to both categories of entity, consistently treat as a meaningful taxonomic difference rather than a matter of degree within the same species. The most frequently cited of these distinguishing characteristics concerns scale, where the reptilian entities described throughout this script's preceding 4 sections are reported with a body height broadly comparable to adult human range, typically falling between approximately 5.5 and 7 feet in the most frequently documented cases. The Alpha-Draconian entities described in the testimony examined in this section are reported considerably larger, with height estimates across independent case files clustering most densely in a range from approximately 7 to 12 feet. With outlying descriptions in a small number of cases, attributing significantly greater scale. Still, though these extreme outlier accounts are treated with additional methodological caution in this script and flagged accordingly. The second most consistently reported distinguishing characteristic concerns a feature that gives this section its subtitle, the presence of functional or vestigial wing structures, described across a sufficient number of independent accounts to have established a baseline expectation within the research literature, with the detailed description varying considerably from witness to witness in ways that researchers in the field regard as consistent with genuine, independent observation of a real but complex biological feature, rather than as evidence of simple contamination from a common source, since a uniform description across all accounts would itself be more consistent with the spread of a single influential text than with the organic variation that genuine perceptual experience typically produces. The wing structures, as described, do not appear in the testimony to function primarily as a locomotion mechanism in the conventional sense, and a number of witnesses who describe having observed the entities at close range specifically note that the structures appeared folded, retracted, or otherwise held in a non-deployed configuration during the observed encounter, which several researchers have taken as evidence that they serve a signaling or status function within Alpha-Draconian social dynamics as readily as, or more readily than, a purely mechanical one. This interpretation connects to a broader thread in the Alpha-Draconian testimony that distinguishes these entities from their reptilian counterparts in terms not only of physical scale and structure, but of bearing, presence, and what a number of witnesses attempt to describe, with varying degrees of precision, as a qualitative difference in the kind of awareness or intelligence they project. Where reptilian entities are most often described in the case file literature as purposeful, but in some sense clinical, focused on the immediate operational task, and projecting what multiple witnesses independently describe as a quality of instrumental regard, a sense of being assessed rather than encountered. The Alpha-Draconian entities appear in witness accounts far less frequently as background presences directing or overseeing reptilian activity, and when they do appear as primary subjects of encounter, the quality of presence attributed to them by witnesses is described with language that shifts register markedly, not clinical but commanding, not purposeful but regal, a distinction that recurs across enough independent accounts in enough consistent formulation to have become one of the recognized baseline descriptors in the research literature, while acknowledging, as this script has consistently acknowledged throughout, that the subjective quality of a witnessed presence is among the most unreliable categories of testimony available to any researcher, shaped by expectation, cultural template, and retrospective interpretation in ways that physical description, whatever its own limitations, is somewhat less susceptible to. The question of the Alpha-Draconian relationship to the reptilian entities documented in the preceding sections is, within the broader literature, treated as largely settled in the sense that the overwhelming weight of testimony points in a consistent direction, even as the mechanisms and historical origin of that relationship remain considerably more contested. The consistent direction is hierarchical subordination. The testimony, taken in aggregate, describes the reptilian entities this script has already examined as operating within a command structure in which the Alpha-Draconians occupy the uppermost tier, with the practical relationship between the two described variously depending on which witness account and which researcher's interpretive framework one consults, as analogous to a military chain of command, a feudal relationship of lord and vassal, or, in the more elaborately developed versions of the testimony, a relationship with specifically genetic or lineage-based foundations in which the reptilian entity's own origins as a species are presented as in some degree derivative from or shaped by the much older Alpha-Draconian presence, a claim this script examines in considerably more detail in the section that follows this one. What is worth establishing here, before turning to origins, is what the testimony says about the practical mechanics of this hierarchical relationship as it is alleged to operate in the present era, because it is this layer of the testimony that connects most directly to the physical encounter cases that form the core evidentiary base of this script. The practical mechanics, as described across the witness accounts most closely examined by the field's leading investigators, center on what a number of these researchers describe as a delegation model. The Alpha-Draconian entities are not themselves primarily engaged in the direct conduct of the biological and genetic research programs documented extensively in this script's preceding sections, that direct conduct being attributed in the testimony consistently to the reptilian entities whose operational presence on Earth the previous sections have already established, but rather exercise their influence and authority through what witnesses describe as periodic oversight, directional intervention in cases of significant operational decision-making, and a presence within the joint facilities examined in the previous section that is described not as constant, but as occasion-specific, and, in the testimony of those claiming direct observation of both categories of entity within shared environments, accompanied by a visible shift in the behavioral register of the reptilian entities present, a shift toward deference, reduced autonomy of movement and communication, and what multiple witnesses independently characterize as a heightening of collective attentiveness that they contrast explicitly with the more routinized behavioral patterns they describe observing during periods when only reptilian entities were present. This detail, the reported behavioral modulation of reptilian entities in the alleged presence of Alpha-Draconian oversight figures, is treated by researchers who find it credible as one of the more compelling pieces of testimony internal evidence for a genuine hierarchical relationship rather than a constructed one, on the grounds that this specific behavioral nuance is not a prominent feature of the popular cultural representations of non-human hierarchies available in the literature and media, most likely to influence contaminated testimony, making its independent recurrence across unconnected witnesses more difficult to attribute to simple cultural borrowing than many other elements of the testimony this script has examined. The historical depth attributed to the Alpha-Draconian presence in the testimony examined in this section substantially exceeds even the already considerable antiquity attributed to the reptilian entities in this script's earlier sections, and it is here that the Alpha-Draconian material intersects most extensively with the ancient civilization literature that forms a parallel and overlapping body of research, largely distinct from, but frequently referenced within the abduction-centered testimony this script has primarily drawn on throughout. A recurring claim in the most detailed versions of the Alpha-Draconian origin testimony holds that this race's involvement with Earth predates not only the rise of human civilization as conventionally understood, but the emergence of anatomically modern humanity itself, a claim that, if taken at face value, places the beginning of the alleged Alpha-Draconian terrestrial relationship at a point in geological and evolutionary time that no independent evidence currently available to conventional science either confirms or definitively excludes, a formulation this script applies deliberately and with care, since the honest methodological position in this territory is neither credulous acceptance nor confident dismissal, but acknowledgement of the limits of what the available evidence base can currently establish. Within this broader origin claim, a specific and more controversial subset of the testimony asserts a direct Alpha-Draconian role in what witnesses variously describe as the engineering, modification, or acceleration of the human species itself, a claim that connects the Alpha-Draconian material to the broader ancient astronaut literature referenced only briefly in the opening sections of this script and examined in considerably more depth in the section of this documentary treating the Anunnaki material, which follows the Alpha-Draconian sections and to which this script will direct the viewer's attention in due course. Within the Alpha-Draconian testimony, this claim of involvement in human origins takes several distinct forms that this script treats separately since their evidentiary weight and their internal consistency with the broader body of testimony vary considerably. The first and most frequently encountered form simply asserts temporal precedence, that the Alpha-Draconian entities were present on or in proximity to Earth before the emergence of the human species, a claim that is consistent with the stellar origin narrative already discussed and that adds little specific content beyond the temporal framing. The second form is more specific and more consequential, the assertion that the Alpha-Draconian presence had a direct causal relationship to the characteristics of the human species as it subsequently developed, whether through genetic intervention of the kind the reptilian testimony also describes, through the structuring of early human social and religious institutions in ways that served Alpha-Draconian long-term interests, or through some combination of both operating across an extended period. The third form, encountered least frequently in the testimony but treated with particular attention by a subset of researchers precisely because of the specificity of its claims, goes further still, asserting that the relationship between the Alpha-Draconian entities and the human species includes an element that the most direct versions of this testimony describe as proprietorial, a claimed relationship of investment and return on investment, that the witnesses advancing this version of the claim most often frame in language that is explicitly economic or resource-based in character, describing humanity's development and population growth in terms the alleged entities are said to regard as a managed and monitored process oriented toward an eventual extraction of resources, the precise nature of which remains contested within the testimony itself and will be examined further in the section of this script addressing Alpha-Draconian strategic objectives. Before turning to those strategic objectives in the following section, this section closes with two observations that the researchers most deeply involved with the Alpha-Draconian testimony regard as structurally important for understanding what distinguishes this material from the reptilian case file literature that preceded it in this script. The first concerns the character of the encounter testimony itself, where the reptilian abduction case files documented in this script's preceding sections, whatever the interpretive controversy surrounding them, consist in the main of accounts in which individual witnesses describe personal, embodied experiences of encounter, abduction, examination, and communication. The Alpha-Draconian testimony is far more heavily weighted toward what might be called observational or positional testimony, witnesses claiming to have seen or sensed rather than directly encountered, personnel claiming to have received briefings about rather than direct exposure to, and in the cases involving claimed government or military context, individuals describing the Alpha-Draconians as subjects of institutional knowledge held at a remove, rather than as entities they themselves had direct contact with. The practical consequence of this distributional difference is that the Alpha-Draconian testimony, for all its internal consistency and for all the impressiveness of the hierarchical picture it assembles, rests on a somewhat thinner base of the direct, personal, experiential testimony that constitutes the closest analog to primary evidence available in this field, and this script regards that difference as worth making explicit rather than glossing over in the interest of narrative coherence. The second observation concerns a specific and recurring element of the Alpha-Draconian testimony that distinguishes it from the reptilian material in a way that several of the field's most careful investigators have flagged as analytically significant without arriving at a consensus about what it signifies: the consistent attribution across independent witness accounts of what these witnesses attempt to describe as an extreme antiquity of purpose, a quality distinct from mere age or longevity, described by those who attempt to put it into words as a sense conveyed in the alleged presence of these entities that their objectives and orientations are so old, so settled, and so long-term in their framing that the category of urgency, which dominates the behavioral descriptions of reptilian entities in operational contexts, simply does not apply, replaced by something that witnesses reach for different vocabulary to name, with patience and certainty and inevitability appearing most frequently across independent accounts, a convergence of descriptive language that researchers in the field note is not easily produced by cultural contamination, since none of these terms feature prominently in the popular representations of Alpha-Draconian entities available in the broader culture. Whether this convergence reflects genuine, independent perception of a real quality of these alleged entities, a shared psychological projection onto a figure occupying the apex position of the hierarchy the testimony describes, or some other mechanism entirely, this script, as it has throughout, does not resolve. It presents the convergence as one of the more structurally interesting features of the Alpha-Draconian testimony and leaves the question of its ultimate explanation to the viewer's own assessment of the broader framework this documentary has assembled. Alpha-Draconians, Strategic Objectives, Ancient Presence, and Case Studies. The preceding section established the physical and behavioral profile the testimony attributes to the Alpha-Draconian entities, outlined the hierarchical relationship the witness accounts describe between this race and the reptilian entities examined in this script's earlier sections, and closed with two structural observations about what distinguishes the Alpha-Draconian testimony from the reptilian case file literature in ways that bear directly on how that testimony should be evaluated. This section turns to the two remaining questions that the Alpha-Draconian material raises, and that any honest treatment of it must address directly: what the testimony says these entities want, understood at the level of long-term strategic objective rather than immediate operational activity, and what the case study material that researchers in the field regard as most thoroughly investigated actually contains when examined in the detail this script applies to its strongest examples. Between those two subjects, this section also examines the ancient presence testimony that Part 5 introduced briefly but did not develop fully, since the strategic objectives attributed to the Alpha-Draconians in the witness accounts cannot be understood in isolation from the temporal scale across which those objectives are alleged to have been pursued, a scale the testimony insists must be measured not in decades or centuries, but in geological epochs that place the beginning of the alleged program well outside the reach of any documentary historical record and most conventional archaeological inference. The strategic objectives attributed to the Alpha-Draconian entities in the testimony examined by the field's most experienced researchers can be grouped, with some simplification that this script acknowledges, into three broad and partially overlapping categories, each of which has a distinct evidentiary base within the broader witness literature, and each of which connects to different threads already introduced in earlier sections of this documentary. The first and most widely attested of these categories concerns what the testimony most consistently describes using the language of stewardship or management, a claimed orientation toward the human species and the Earth's broader biological systems that the witnesses who articulate it most clearly are at pains to distinguish from either benevolent interest or simple exploitation, describing instead something they reach for comparisons to characterize. A rancher's relationship to livestock appears in a number of independent accounts, as does a custodian's relationship to a managed resource, and in a smaller but notable subset of cases, the language of an investor's relationship to a long-term holding, each of these analogies capturing a different facet of what the witnesses are attempting to convey, and none of them, as the witnesses themselves typically acknowledge, fully adequate to the phenomenon they are describing. What is consistent across these varied attempts at analogy is the underlying relational structure they are all trying to name. A relationship in which the Alpha-Draconian entities are positioned in their own alleged self-understanding as conveyed through the testimony as prior claimants to the human species and to the biological and energetic resources associated with it, a claim of priority grounded not in current power but in temporal precedence, in having been present and in some versions of the testimony having been causally involved long before the human species reached the form or the population scale it currently exhibits. The second category of strategic objective attributed to the Alpha-Draconians in the testimony is more specific and connects directly to the population level and institutional threads already examined in the reptilian sections of this script. This category concerns what a substantial number of witnesses, including several who claim the kind of insider governmental or military positioning described in the collusion material of Part 4, describe as an active interest in the management of human social, political, and institutional development across recorded history, not through direct intervention of the physically visible kind, the abduction testimony documents, but through a longer and more indirect chain of influence, operating through intermediate human structures, elite lineages, and, in the most elaborately developed versions of this testimony, through the reptilian entities themselves acting as a proximate layer of influence on human affairs. The Alpha-Draconian interest being more fundamental and more distal while remaining ultimately directive. This thread connects the Alpha-Draconian material to the conspiracy-adjacent literature on elite bloodlines and covert institutional control that exists as a parallel and extensively developed body of popular material largely outside the scope of this script's primary focus, and this script notes the connection without endorsing the elaboration, observing only that the Alpha-Draconian testimony intersects with that broader literature at precisely the points one would expect if both were drawing on a common underlying set of claims, while remaining agnostic about whether that intersection reflects a shared basis in reality, a shared basis in a particular tradition of speculative writing that predates both bodies of material in their current popular form, or simply the tendency of elaborate explanatory frameworks to absorb and integrate adjacent claims as they develop over time within communities of active believers and researchers. The third category of strategic objective is the most contested within the research community itself, not because it lacks witnesses willing to assert it, but because the specific form of the claim strains the interpretive frameworks even of researchers already committed to taking the broader Alpha-Draconian testimony seriously. This category concerns what a subset of witnesses, drawn disproportionately from those claiming direct or near-direct contact with Alpha-Draconian entities, rather than from those whose testimony is positional or observational in the sense discussed at the close of Part 5, describe as a dimensional or existential component to the Alpha-Draconian interest in humanity. The claim that the resource the Alpha-Draconian entities are most fundamentally oriented toward extracting from the human species is not biological in the narrow sense, not genetic material or physical labor or territorial access, but something the witnesses who advance this version of the claim most often describe using language borrowed from the vocabulary of consciousness or energetic states, attempting to articulate a claimed Alpha-Draconian interest in human emotional and psychological output that the most direct versions of this testimony describe as functioning as a kind of sustenance or fuel for the entities in question, a claim that this script presents here with the explicit notation that it represents the outermost boundary of what the testimony literature discusses, and that the evidentiary base for this specific claim is thinner and more concentrated in a smaller number of sources than any other major claim examined in this script, warranting a correspondingly lower confidence in its status as a genuine recurrent element of independent witness experience, rather than a widely circulated interpretive framework that has been absorbed into testimony through secondary exposure. Returning to the ancient presence material that Part 5 introduced, and that the strategic objectives just discussed cannot be fully contextualized without, the testimony most directly bearing on the deep historical Alpha-Draconian presence on Earth draws on three distinct categories of source that this script treats separately because their evidentiary character differs in ways that matter for how they should be weighted. The first category consists of the small number of witnesses who claim personal communication, whether through direct encounter or through what they describe as nonverbal information transfer, of the kind reported in a subset of close contact abduction cases across both the reptilian and Alpha-Draconian literature, in which content described as historical, cosmological, or encyclopedic in scope is said to have been conveyed in compressed or non-sequential form during the encounter itself, and reconstructed in linear narrative form only afterward by the witness, a process whose reliability is the subject of the same methodological concerns this script has raised throughout regarding memory reconstruction and its susceptibility to interpretive shaping. The second category consists of researchers who argue that the archaeological and iconographic record of ancient civilizations, examined through the interpretive lens provided by the witness testimony rather than through the frameworks of conventional archaeology, contains embedded evidence of Alpha-Draconian presence or influence that becomes visible only when the observer knows what they are looking at. A category of argument this script treats with particular caution since its evidentiary logic is circular in a way that should be made explicit. The same body of testimony that provides the interpretive key is also what the reinterpreted archaeological evidence is said to support, producing a closed loop in which each element appears to confirm the other without either providing independent verification. The third category is more modest in its claims and correspondingly more defensible in its logic. The observation that the specific stellar reference point of Alpha Draconis appears with notable frequency in the astronomical and architectural orientations of ancient cultures that had no obvious reason to privilege that particular star on the basis of its conventional astronomical significance. An observation that is factually verifiable in the narrow sense that the orientations in question are a matter of documented record, while its interpretation as evidence of deliberate Alpha-Draconian signaling or influence remains, as with all interpretive claims in this territory, a matter of inference rather than demonstration. Two case studies close this section, selected on the same criteria applied in Part 4, independent corroboration where available, investigation by researchers without prior commitment to a particular interpretive outcome, and the presence of at least one element in the case that resists easy explanation through the most obvious alternative frameworks available to a skeptical reviewer. The first case involves a former signals intelligence analyst with documented service in the armed forces of a major English-speaking nation who came forward through an intermediary researcher in the mid-2000s, describing what he characterized not as a personal encounter with Alpha-Draconian entities, but as a pattern of anomalous signals intercept activity he had been involved in processing during a specific assignment in the late 1980s. Activity that his superiors at the time attributed through official channels to a foreign nation's experimental communications program, but that the witness described as bearing characteristics, particularly in frequency, modulation pattern, and the geometric regularity of the encoded content that he and several colleagues had privately concluded at the time were inconsistent with any known human communications technology or practice. The witness stated that a specific subset of the intercept material, recovered across a period of approximately 8 months and originating from a consistent geographic locus in a remote region of Central Asia, contained content that he and one colleague had partially decoded using techniques developed outside their official analytical framework, and that the partially decoded content, which he declined to describe in specific detail on grounds he stated related to a secrecy obligation he continued to regard as binding, was consistent in its structural characteristics with what he subsequently, years after leaving his analytical role and encountering the broader research literature independently, recognized as a non-human communication signature of the type described in the Alpha-Draconian contact material. The researcher who first received this testimony conducted a partial verification of the witness's claimed service record and assignment history through available public records, confirming the broad outlines of his biographical claims without being able to access the operational details the witness described, a pattern of partial corroboration that this script treats as consistent with the testimony having a genuine experiential basis, while acknowledging that it falls considerably short of the independent verification that would be required to treat the specific intercept claims as established. The second case examined here is distinguished from most of the case study material in this script by its collective rather than individual character, and by the unusual degree of documentation generated in real time rather than reconstructed after the fact. It concerns a group of 12 individuals who participated in an extended residential research program organized by an independent non-governmental research organization in the western United States during the early 1990s, a program specifically designed to create controlled conditions under which anomalous contact experiences could be invited, monitored, and documented with a degree of methodological rigor that the field had not previously attempted at comparable scale. Of the 12 participants, 7 reported experiences during the program that they subsequently described as contact with entities matching the Alpha-Draconian physical description established in Part 5, with the remaining 5 reporting either no anomalous experience or experiences they attributed to other categories of entity, a distribution that the program's organizers noted was itself a meaningful data point since it argued against a simple group suggestion mechanism as a sufficient explanation for the reported contacts, on the grounds that a pure suggestion effect would be expected to produce more uniform rather than more differentiated outcomes across a group of participants who had been exposed to identical framing and preparation. Among the 7 who reported Alpha-Draconian contact, 3 independently described what they later characterized as a communication conveying a specific and verifiable claim that a particular geographic location in the immediate vicinity of the research facility, described in enough detail that researchers subsequently identified a specific site matching the description, had been a point of repeated Alpha-Draconian activity in a period the witnesses placed with no prior knowledge of the relevant geological timeline, at an interval consistent with a major volcanic event in the regional geological record. When researchers subsequently investigated the identified site, they found physical anomalies in the subsurface composition, documented through standard geological survey equipment, that a consulting geologist described as unusual without being able to account for them through conventional geological processes available to explain the surrounding area. A finding that the research organization published in a privately circulated report that this script has reviewed and that represents, within the evidentiary standards applicable to this entire field, one of the more unusual instances of testimony making a specific and subsequently investigated physical prediction while falling well short, as the consulting geologist's own careful language made clear, of constituting proof of the Alpha-Draconian activity the witnesses attributed to the site. Taken together, the strategic objective testimony, the ancient presence material, and the 2 case studies examined in this section complete the picture this script set out to build regarding the Alpha-Draconian entities, a race the testimony describes as among the most ancient presences associated with Earth, operating through a hierarchical structure in which the reptilian entities of the preceding sections function as an intermediate and more operationally active stratum. Pursuing objectives, the testimony characterizes as long-term and proprietorial in character, oriented toward the human species as a managed resource in ways that have allegedly shaped the development of human civilization from its earliest periods to the present, and detectable in the witness record both through the small number of direct contact cases that constitute the closest analog to primary evidence available in this field, and through a broader pattern of positional, observational, and institutionally sourced testimony that, taken in aggregate, assembles a picture whose internal consistency is treated by the field's most experienced researchers as one of its most significant features, while the methodological concerns this script has raised throughout about how internal consistency is produced in a research community with access to a common body of prior testimony remain, as they have throughout this documentary, unresolved. What remains unaddressed, and what the following section of this script begins to approach, is the question that the Alpha-Draconian material has gestured toward in its more expansive versions without fully confronting whether the hierarchy this script has described, with its reptilian operational stratum and its Alpha-Draconian oversight tier, is itself the complete picture the testimony offers, or whether the deepest and most elaborately developed strands of the contact literature describe a still more fundamental and more ancient layer of the non-human presence on Earth, one whose relationship to both the species already examined and to humanity differs in kind rather than merely in degree, a category of testimony this script has reserved for the final section of this documentary, and to which it now turns. Insectoids, morphology, behavioral testimony, and the problem of the unhuman mind. The 3 preceding sections of this script examined races whose relationship to the human species, whatever the contested specifics of that relationship turn out to be, is described in the testimony as in some sense long and investment-laden, a relationship of interest, intervention, and in the most elaborate versions of the testimony, of something approaching ownership or stewardship that implies a degree of orientation toward humanity as an object of sustained concern. However, that concern is ultimately interpreted. The insectoid entities that this section examines represent, within the broader contact literature, a category that challenges that framework at its foundations, not because the testimony describes them as uninterested in humanity, since the case file material makes clear that their interactions with human witnesses are purposeful and in some respects methodologically sophisticated, but because the quality of that interest, as conveyed across the witness accounts, most carefully examined by researchers in this field, resists the anthropomorphizing frameworks through which the reptilian, Alpha-Draconian, and Anunnaki material can, with varying degrees of strain, still be understood. Where those races are described in terms that retain a recognizable relational grammar, a grammar of hierarchy, of investment, of long-term strategic interest, of something that the testimony can frame, however uncomfortably, in terms of purposes a human mind can grasp, the insectoid testimony consistently returns to a different register, one that researchers in the field have come to describe, with a consistency that this script treats as itself worth noting, as the encounter with a genuinely alien cognition. Not alien in the colloquial sense of strange or unfamiliar, but alien in a deeper and more disorienting sense, a form of awareness and intentionality whose operational logic the witnesses who have been closest to it describe as apprehensible in fragments, but not, in any of the cases this script examines, fully translatable into the conceptual vocabulary available to a human observer. That characterization deserves scrutiny before the descriptive material begins, because it is the kind of claim that can too easily function as a way of placing a category of testimony beyond the reach of critical evaluation by defining it as inherently beyond evaluation. This script does not intend it in that way and does not think the researchers who have most consistently applied it intend it that way either. What the characterization is trying to capture and what the witness accounts themselves repeatedly attempt and repeatedly find inadequate language for is something more specific than mere strangeness. A quality of encounter in which the operational behavior of the entities described is clearly purposeful and clearly directed at the witness, while the purpose itself remains opaque in a way that differs from the opacity of reptilian or alpha-draconian purpose. In the latter cases, witnesses frequently describe not understanding the full scope or significance of what is being done to them, but they typically retain a sense that the entities conducting the encounter understand very well what they are doing and why, and that a complete account of the encounter's purpose would be expressible in terms of goals, resources, and strategies recognizable as such to a human mind. In the insectoid testimony, a meaningfully different proportion of witnesses describe an encounter in which not only the purpose, but the very category of purposiveness seems to operate according to a different logic, one that several witnesses, across independent accounts and without apparent access to each other's testimony, reach for the same comparison to describe. The relationship of a scientist to the organisms being studied in a sense that implies not cruelty, but a form of attention in which the subject's own interiority is simply not a relevant variable, a comparison that recurs often enough across independent accounts to have become one of the baseline descriptors in the research literature, while remaining, as this script acknowledges, a subjective characterization of a quality of presence that is among the most difficult features of any encounter testimony to evaluate or corroborate independently. The physical description the testimony attributes to insectoid entities is, compared to the reptilian and alpha-draconian material examined in earlier sections, both more internally consistent across independent witnesses and more obviously susceptible to cultural contamination from the long tradition of insect-derived alien imagery in popular science fiction and visual media. Attention this script addresses directly and returns to when evaluating the evidentiary weight of individual cases. The baseline physical profile established across the most thoroughly investigated case files describes entities ranging in height from approximately 4 to 7 feet, with the modal height in the most consistently reported accounts falling somewhat below average human stature, a detail that witnesses who describe having been physically proximate to the entities frequently note as contributing to a quality of encounter distinct from the physically imposing character of both reptilian and Alpha-Draconian encounters. The body plan described is bilaterally symmetrical and broadly bipedal, with the bipedal stance frequently described as slightly forward inclined in a way multiple witnesses attempt to characterize as suggesting a body architecture that accommodates upright posture without having been optimized for it in the way human anatomy has, a detail that may or may not survive the methodological scrutiny applied elsewhere in this script, but that recurs with enough consistency across independent accounts to warrant notation. The limbs described in the testimony are uniformly reported as more numerous or more jointed than human anatomy provides, with the most consistent description attributing 4 to 6 upper limbs of varying apparent function, the outermost pair longer and more manipulative in character, the inner pairs shorter and more varied in the roles witnesses describe them performing, a configuration that several medical and anatomical professionals consulted by researchers in this field have noted is not straightforwardly derived from any single insect morphology available as a cultural template, since the specific combination of features described does not map cleanly onto any of the insect species most prominently represented in the science fiction and horror visual traditions, most likely to supply contaminating imagery, a detail that the field's more empirically minded investigators treat as a minor but non-trivial point in favor of the description having some basis in genuine perceptual experience, rather than being entirely constructed from available cultural material. The head and facial morphology described in the insectoid testimony is the most consistently reported feature across independent case files, and the feature that generates the most acute distress in the psychological accounts witnesses give of their encounter experience. A connection between morphological description and emotional response that this script regards as worth examining rather than simply noting. The head as described is large relative to body proportion in a way broadly consistent with the gray entity descriptions familiar from the better-known abduction literature, but with a set of distinguishing features that the witness accounts, even those unfamiliar with the gray literature, consistently articulate. The presence of large, faceted, or compound visual organs, described by the majority of witnesses as dark, iridescent, or reflective in a way that human eyes are not, and understood by the witnesses themselves in most cases as functioning differently from human eyes in terms of the range or nature of visual processing they perform, though the witness's basis for this inference is typically the quality of the gaze attributed to the entities rather than any direct knowledge of their sensory physiology. The mandibular or mouthpart structures described are, across the majority of accounts, present, but described as vestigial or functionally secondary, in the sense that witnesses who describe having received communication from these entities consistently report that communication as occurring through non-vocal channels, a feature shared with the Alpha-Draconian and Anunnaki communication testimony already examined in this script, but described in the Insectoid testimony with a specific additional quality. Not simply the bypassing of verbal language in favor of a more direct form of information transfer, but the sense, reported across multiple independent accounts, that the communication channel itself carries less content of the kind human communication typically prioritizes, less context, less relational framing, less of what several witnesses describe as the sense of being addressed as an individual, and more of what they attempt to characterize as instruction or data transfer, a distinction that connects to the unhuman cognition theme already introduced in this section's opening. The integumentary description, meaning the surface covering of the entities as described, shows somewhat more variation across independent accounts than the structural morphology, which researchers in the field attribute to two possible explanations that are not mutually exclusive. Genuine variation within the insectoid population encountered by witnesses, consistent with the biological diversity one would expect within any species, and the particular difficulty of accurately perceiving and subsequently recalling a surface texture and coloration that the majority of witnesses describe as having no close analog in their prior perceptual experience, making the linguistic encoding and later recall of that specific feature more susceptible to distortion than the encoding and recall of structural features that can be anchored to familiar comparative categories, even when the overall morphology is unfamiliar. The most common surface description involves a chitinous or shell-like quality attributed to at least the outer body surface, with coloration reports clustering most densely around dark ranges, gray-green, deep brown, and near black, though a non-trivial minority of accounts describe a quality of translucency or iridescence in certain lighting conditions that witnesses who report it consistently flag as among the most disorienting features of the visual encounter, in ways they find difficult to articulate, but that several describe as contributing to an uncertainty about the boundary between the entity's physical surface and the space immediately surrounding it, a perceptual experience that the most skeptically inclined researchers attribute to the distorting effects of fear on visual processing, and that the more sympathetic researchers treat as a potentially genuine observation of a surface property with no close human experiential analog. The behavioral patterns attributed to insectoid entities in the encounter testimony establish a profile that differs from the reptilian case material in ways that this script's earlier methodological discussion of the unhuman cognition question anticipated, but that are worth specifying in concrete terms rather than leaving at the level of the general characterization already offered. The most consistently reported behavioral feature across independently documented insectoid encounter cases is a quality of procedural focus that witnesses contrast explicitly with the reptilian behavioral profile, even in cases where the witness has no prior familiarity with the reptilian testimony. Where reptilian entities are described as purposeful but responsive, in the sense of modulating their behavior in apparent response to the witness's reactions, communications, or resistance, the insectoid entities described in the testimony overwhelmingly do not appear to witnesses as responsive in this way, proceeding through whatever examination or procedure constitutes the encounter's apparent purpose, with a consistency that witnesses describe variously as relentless, automated, or, in several cases with a specific comparison that recurs across independent accounts, as resembling the behavior of an organism following an extremely detailed and internally specified program, rather than navigating a situation in real time. A behavioral description that several researchers have noted is consistent with the hypothesis that the entities described operate according to a form of collective or distributed cognition in which individual behavioral flexibility is not required because the program being executed is specified at a level above the individual entity, with coordination and direction coming from a source that the individual entity need not consciously process in the way a human operative would need to consciously process instructions from a superior. This collective cognition hypothesis is the most elaborately developed theoretical framework specific to the insectoid testimony and deserves somewhat more detailed treatment than this script has given to the various theoretical frameworks proposed throughout the earlier sections, partly because it is more specific and therefore more susceptible to at least partial evaluation against the testimony it proposes to explain, and partly because it connects the insectoid material to a broader and more fundamental question this script has not yet addressed directly: the question of whether the non-human presences examined throughout this documentary, whatever their ultimate origin and nature, represent forms of consciousness analogous in their fundamental organization to human consciousness, operating with individual goals, individual awareness, and individual intentionality of the kind the human mind is equipped to recognize and engage with, or whether some of them represent something categorically different, a form of organized intelligence in which the individual unit of the encounter is not the relevant locus of awareness or decision, and in which the human tendency to locate a mind behind a face and to seek relationship with the entity directly confronted is not merely culturally conditioned, but structurally inappropriate to what is actually being encountered. The insectoid testimony, taken seriously on its own terms, pushes harder against the first of these assumptions than any other category of contact testimony this script examines, and the researchers who have studied it most carefully regard this pressure as one of its most significant features, whatever one ultimately concludes about its ultimate origin. The relationship between insectoid entities and the reptilian and alpha-draconian races examined in earlier sections is, within the research literature, considerably less settled than the hierarchical relationship between those two races, and this script presents the available testimony on the question without imposing a resolution the evidence does not support. A minority strand of the testimony, sourced primarily from witnesses who claim to have observed both insectoid and reptilian entities within shared operational environments, describes the relationship as hierarchical in the reptilian entity's favor, with the insectoids functioning in something analogous to a technical or specialist role within a broader operational structure ultimately directed by reptilian authority, a characterization that would integrate the insectoid entities into the hierarchical framework already established across this script's preceding sections without fundamentally disrupting it. A roughly comparable strand of testimony resists this hierarchical framing entirely, describing encounters in which insectoid and reptilian entities appeared to operate in parallel rather than in subordination, with no observable indication of command relationship between them, a pattern that several researchers interpret as evidence that the insectoid entities represent an entirely independent operational presence with their own distinct program of interest in the human species, rather than a specialist stratum within the reptilian or alpha-draconian hierarchy. A smaller third strand of testimony, the most difficult to evaluate and the one this script treats with the greatest caution, describes the relationship as historically variable, suggesting that the operational relationship between these races has shifted across different periods and in different geographic or functional contexts in ways that make any single static characterization of their relationship inadequate, a position that is internally coherent and potentially accurate, but that is also, as the more methodologically cautious researchers in the field acknowledge, the kind of claim that becomes unfalsifiable very quickly, since a relationship described as variable across time and context can in principle accommodate any combination of observational data without disconfirmation. The case study material available in the insectoid-specific literature presents a different distribution of case types than the reptilian material examined in Part 4, in ways that reflect the distinct character of the insectoid encounter testimony already discussed, where the strongest reptilian cases tend to involve multiple independent witnesses, physical evidence, or institutional corroboration of some kind. The strongest insectoid cases tend to be distinguished not by external corroboration, but by the internal coherence and psychological specificity of single witness accounts, a distinction that is partly a product of the apparently more controlled and less physically disruptive character of many reported insectoid encounters, and partly a reflection of the particular psychological aftermath that the most thoroughly investigated insectoid cases describe, an aftermath that differs in character from the PTSD-adjacent symptom picture documented in the reptilian case population, and that the clinicians most closely involved with insectoid experiencers have come to describe as more closely resembling a disruption of the witness's relationship to their own cognitive processes than a response to a physically threatening experience, a distinction with clinical implications that this script examines in the context of the case material below. The first and most extensively documented case in the insectoid literature that this script examines in detail involves a mathematician at a research university in the Pacific Northwestern United States who came to the attention of a researcher in the mid-1990s, not through the usual channels of UFO research organizations or experiencer support networks, but through a colleague who had independently been contacted by the same researcher regarding an unrelated case and mentioned the mathematician's increasingly disrupted professional functioning as something she believed might be relevant. The mathematician, who agreed to participate in the investigation only under conditions of strict anonymity that this script continues to honor, described a series of encounters beginning approximately 2 years prior to the researcher's involvement that had, by the time of the first interview, produced what the mathematician characterized, with the precision one might expect from someone trained in formal systems, as a progressive corruption of their intuitive mathematical reasoning, a sense they described in some detail as the feeling that the normally unconscious processes through which mathematical insight arrives had been interfered with in a way that left the processes themselves visible and therefore inaccessible in the way that a word repeated too many times loses its meaning. The physical description provided of the entities encountered matched the insectoid baseline already established in this section with a consistency that the investigating researcher regarded as notable given the mathematician's stated prior unfamiliarity with the contact literature and their expressed skepticism about it, and the procedural character of the encounters as described corresponded closely to the non-responsive, program-following behavioral profile already discussed, with the specific additional feature that the mathematician described the focus of the encounters as being oriented not toward physical examination of the body in the manner dominant in the reptilian case literature, but toward what they described, with evident difficulty in finding adequate language, as something more like access to or interaction with the processes of reasoning itself, a description that the investigating researcher flagged as unique in their prior case file experience, and that 2 subsequent researchers who examined the case independently regarded as among the more remarkable features of the entire insectoid testimony literature, both because of its specificity and because of the professional context that gave the witness an unusually precise vocabulary for characterizing changes in cognitive process that a witness without the same training might not have been able to articulate with comparable precision. The clinical follow-up conducted as part of this case's investigation, with the witness's consent and conducted by a psychologist with prior experience with the experiencer population, found no evidence of the major psychiatric diagnoses most likely to produce the reported experiences as purely endogenous phenomena, and found instead a cognitive profile that the examining psychologist described in their written assessment as unusual without being classifiable, characterized by intact formal reasoning capacity, alongside what the psychologist described as a specific and difficult to characterize disruption in what they termed the pre-reflective layer of mathematical intuition, a finding that mapped closely onto the mathematician's own characterization of their experience, and that the psychologist stated they had not previously encountered in a clinical context, a convergence between the witness's self-report and the independent clinical finding that the investigating researchers treated as one of the more compelling features of the case, and that this script presents as such while acknowledging that a clinical finding of unusual without being classifiable is, by its nature, evidence of something that does not fit existing frameworks rather than positive evidence for any specific alternative explanation. The second case is briefer in this script's treatment and was selected not for the depth of its investigation, which is more limited than the first, but for the specific and structurally important feature it introduces into the insectoid testimony record, the presence of a second witness whose independent account corroborated not only the occurrence of an encounter, but a specific and unusual detail within it, the kind of cross-witness corroboration on a specific non-obvious detail that this script has throughout treated as the closest available analog to independent verification in a field where conventional verification mechanisms are largely unavailable. The case involves 2 individuals, strangers to each other at the time of the encounter, who reported separately to the same research organization within a period of approximately 6 weeks, an encounter that they had each experienced independently in the same geographic location, a remote area of high desert in the American Southwest, with a separation in time between the two encounters of approximately 11 days. The specific detail both witnesses independently reported, without prior contact with each other, and without, as far as the investigating researcher could establish, access to each other's reports at the time of their own reporting, was a characteristic of the communication they had each received that both described in closely parallel terms: the sense that the information conveyed during the encounter had arrived not as a sequence, but as a simultaneous totality, a complete structure, apprehended all at once rather than assembled piece by piece, a description that both witnesses reached for musical analogies to express, one describing it as the difference between hearing a melody note by note and hearing all the notes of a symphony at once, the other describing it as receiving what felt like an entire book, not as words on sequential pages, but as the simultaneous presence of all the book's content, a convergence of analogy across two witnesses who had not communicated with each other and whose backgrounds and prior experiences gave them no obvious shared cultural source for that particular comparison, which the investigating researcher, in the field note that constitutes the primary documentation of this case, described as the single detail in their decade of case file work that had most directly challenged their prior commitment to a purely psychological explanation for the insectoid encounter phenomenon. This section closes with an observation about the insectoid testimony's place within the overall picture this script has been building across 8 sections, an observation that is less synthetic in character than the closing synthesis of Part 7 and more perspective, in the sense that it points toward questions the testimony raises without resolving, rather than toward conclusions the testimony permits. The insectoid material, more than any other category of contact testimony examined in this documentary, forces into explicit focus a question that the earlier sections could gesture toward without fully confronting: the question of what it would mean to encounter an intelligence for which the human being is not a subject of relationship but an object of study or use. An intelligence whose operational engagement with the human species is as purposeful and as sustained as anything the reptilian or Alpha-Draconian testimony describes, while being, by the consistent account of those who claim to have experienced it most directly, essentially indifferent to the human interiority it encounters. That is a claim with implications that extend well beyond the evidentiary questions this script has been primarily concerned with throughout, into territory that is philosophical and perhaps existential rather than empirical, and this script notes those implications without claiming to resolve them, observing only that the witness accounts examined in this section represent, if taken seriously on their own terms, an encounter with a form of organized intelligence whose relationship to consciousness, purpose, and other minds operates according to principles that the existing frameworks available to either conventional science or the contact research tradition have not yet found adequate vocabulary to describe, let alone adequately explain. Conclusion: what the testimony asks of us. 8 sections of this documentary have covered a great deal of ground. They have examined, in as much detail as the format permits, 3 distinct non-human races whose characteristics, objectives, and alleged relationships to the human species are described across a body of witness testimony that spans the better part of a century. The Reptilians, ancient and operationally present, conducting across an apparently multi-generational program of biological interest, a sustained engagement with the human species that the most carefully documented case files describe with a specificity and an internal consistency that the field's most experienced researchers argue cannot be entirely dismissed. The Alpha-Draconians, older still, operating through a hierarchical relationship with their reptilian subordinates, pursuing objectives whose timescale the testimony measures in geological epochs and whose orientation toward humanity carries, in the accounts that describe it most directly, the quality of a settled, ancient claim rather than a developing interest. The Anunnaki, whose traces in the oldest written records available to human scholarship, the testimony argues, are neither mythological embellishment nor priestly invention, but a documentary residue of a direct and consequential presence that shaped the human species itself at the biological level before withdrawing from direct terrestrial engagement, at a point the testimony places somewhere in the deep past, and examined last and perhaps most unsettling in the specific character of what it implies, the insectoid entities, whose purposeful engagement with the human species the testimony describes as proceeding according to an operational logic, whose fundamental categories differ from anything the frameworks of either conventional science or the contact research tradition have so far found adequate vocabulary to address. Across all of it, this documentary has tried to hold two things simultaneously that the existing popular treatments of this material have tended to treat as mutually exclusive: a genuine seriousness about the testimony and what it describes, and a genuine seriousness about the methodological problems that stand between that testimony and the kind of evidentiary certainty that would justify treating it as established fact. The tension between those two commitments has been present in every section of this script, sometimes explicitly, and sometimes in the texture of the language itself, in the qualifications and the hedges and the explicit flags that particular claims rest on thinner or more contaminated evidentiary bases than others. This concluding section does not resolve that tension because the honest position is that it cannot be resolved with the evidence currently available, and because the documentary tradition has not always served its viewers well when it has pretended otherwise, in either direction. The uncritical advocacy pieces that present every claim in the contact literature as established and every witness as unimpeachable do their viewers a disservice. The dismissive debunking pieces that treat every witness as either deluded or dishonest, and every researcher as either credulous or fraudulent, do their viewers an equal and opposite disservice. This documentary has tried to occupy the more uncomfortable territory between those two positions, which is also, this production believes, the more honest one. What this production wants to say in this final section is something that is not quite a conclusion in the conventional sense, but is also not quite a question, something that sits between a conclusion and a question in the way that the most significant things one encounters tend to sit. It concerns what the testimony asks of the people who encounter it seriously, not what it proves and not what it fails to prove, but what genuine engagement with it, on its own terms and with honest attention to both its strengths and its limitations, requires of the person doing the engaging. The first thing it requires is the willingness to hold scale. The picture assembled across the preceding 8 sections, if taken seriously as a description of something real, describes a situation of a kind that human cognition is not naturally equipped to process. A presence not of years or decades, but of millions of years. Not of one race with one agenda, but of multiple races with partially overlapping, partially competing, and partially coordinated relationships to the human species and to each other, operating across time scales on which the entirety of recorded human history represents a fraction of the relevant period. The human mind is built for the scales of ordinary life, for the generations of a family and the centuries of a civilization, and the testimony examined in this documentary asks it to stretch far beyond those scales, without losing grip on the particular and the specific, the individual witnesses and the individual cases that constitute the closest thing to evidence this field possesses. Most people who encounter this material seriously report that holding that scale, genuinely holding it rather than notionally acknowledging it and moving on, is one of the most cognitively demanding aspects of the engagement, a report that this production regards as itself informative, regardless of one's position on the testimony's ultimate validity. The second thing it requires is a reckoning with what might be called the problem of comfortable dismissal. The mainstream institutional response to the body of testimony examined in this documentary has, for most of the period across which that testimony has been accumulating, been characterized by a dismissiveness that has not always been earned by the quality of the analysis behind it. A dismissiveness that has at times appeared to reflect institutional interest in a particular conclusion as much as genuine engagement engagement with the evidence. The partial and still incomplete shift in that institutional posture that has occurred in the most recent years, driven by the official acknowledgement of unexplained aerial phenomena by governments that previously denied any serious institutional interest in the subject, does not validate the specific claims of the contact testimony examined in this documentary. And this production wants to be clear that it is not presenting that shift as validation, since what governments have acknowledged is the existence of aerial phenomena they cannot explain, which is a considerably more limited acknowledgement than confirmation of any of the specific claims this documentary has examined. But it does complicate the comfortable position that the entire field can be dismissed without serious engagement, and it asks the person inclined toward dismissal to examine whether their confidence in that position rests on the quality of the evidence examined or on something else. The third thing it requires, and the one this production regards as the most significant and the most rarely discussed in the existing treatments of this material, is a willingness to sit with the possibility that the most important questions the testimony raises may not be the evidentiary ones. Whether the specific physical descriptions in the reptilian case files are accurate, whether the Majestic 12 documents are authentic, whether the Sumerian texts encode a genuine historical memory of non-human presence, whether the insectoid entities described by two strangers in the American Southwest represent genuine independent perceptions of the same real phenomenon. These are important questions, and this documentary has devoted 8 sections to examining the evidence bearing on them with as much care as the format permits. But underneath and behind those evidentiary questions, the testimony as a whole raises something harder and more fundamental: the question of what the human species is in relationship to whatever else exists in the universe that may take an interest in it. The testimony, taken in aggregate, describes humanity as something that has been shaped, managed, studied, harvested, guided, and argued over by presences whose relationship to us has never, according to the testimony, been one of equals. That description, whatever one concludes about its evidentiary status, is not a comfortable one, and the discomfort it produces is not merely a function of the specific claims it makes, but of the framework it implies. A framework in which the human sense of autonomy, of being the authors of our own history and the subjects of our own story, is not an established fact, but a question whose answer the testimony suggests may be considerably more complicated than the conventional account of human civilization allows. This production does not know whether the testimony examined in this documentary describes something real. It has spent 8 sections demonstrating, as precisely as the available evidence permits, both why simple dismissal is more difficult to sustain honestly than it is commonly presented as being, and why confident acceptance is equally difficult to sustain honestly, given the methodological problems that run through the evidentiary base from one end to the other. What it does know, with a confidence grounded not in the specific claims of any individual case or witness, but in the accumulated weight of 8 sections of engagement with the testimony as a whole, is that the questions the testimony raises are not trivial, that the people who have reported these experiences have, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not sought the disruption, the social cost, or the psychological burden that the testimony has brought into their lives, and that the researchers who have devoted careers to studying this material have, in the most serious cases, done so with a rigor and a methodological care that deserves more acknowledgement than the mainstream has typically been willing to offer. Beyond that, this production leaves the viewer where the testimony itself leaves its most careful readers, not with an answer, but with a sharpened sense of what the question is and what it would mean, in both the evidentiary and the existential sense, to answer it. That is, in this production's view, the most honest place a documentary of this kind can leave someone, and it is where this one ends. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.